Hello there. Welcome back to another slow, gentle journey into the quiet corners of the past. You found yourself in just the right place for a calming exploration, one that drifts like a slow breeze through forgotten pages of history. It's a tale that rides just outside the edges of legend, lingering where myth, memory, and marginal notes blur together. Tonight, we are going to softly trace the armor-plated footsteps of a story you may not have heard before, or perhaps only in fragments and echoes. It's a world imagined as entirely male where gallant knights serve kings, fight dragons, and win honor in battlefields and ballrooms alike. But hidden in the folds of that narrative, in the dustier corridors of castles and the quieter corners of manuscripts, there are other figures, softer spoken, perhaps, but no less real. You see, the story of knighthood is so often polished, idealized. Wrapped in shining armor and rigid codes, women in armor, women wielding swords, women commanding garrisons, defending fortresses, stitching wounds on battlefields, and sometimes even earning titles once thought forbidden to them. They weren't many. They weren't often celebrated, but they were there. And tonight, we'll explore their stories not in dramatic clamor, but in steady, soothing detail. If you're awake, settle in with a cup of something warm. And if you're somewhere in between, drifting just on the edge of sleep, you're in exactly the right place. We'll look at how they fought, how they led, and how history tried to forget them. So, if you're lying down, feel free to close your eyes and let yourself relax. Let us begin now with the quiet, heavy path of knighthood itself, and why it was nearly impossible for a woman to ever walk it. What happened to female knights in medieval times? Why you wouldn't last a day? As a woman trying to become a knight, imagine yourself waking before the sun, in a cold stone manor house. In the countryside of medieval France, your hands are calloused, though you are of noble blood. You've trained in secret, perhaps under the watch of a sympathetic brother, a tolerant tutor, or a mother who remembers how to bind a wound. Outside, the fields are soaked with dew, and the forge smolders from the blacksmith's early rise. In the courtyard, squires are already at drill. Lads your age shout and stumble under wooden swords and padded armor, encouraged by gruff voices. But you are not welcome there. Not truly. It was a system, and that system had rules, and one of them, though often unspoken, was this: you may be dressed in simple woolen riding gear, or maybe, just maybe, you've managed to strap on a piece of borrowed armor. It doesn't quite fit. The metal presses into your collarbone awkwardly. Your fingers fumble with the lacing. No one taught you how to properly tie hauberk. You're determined. But the world around you is not designed for you, because to be a knight, a true knight, wasn't just about the sword. It was about bloodlines, oaths, ceremonies, pageantry, maybe even lead troops while he was away if your station permitted it. And the soldiers respected you. But there would be no dubbing ceremony for you, no consecrated sword laid across your shoulders, no stained glass windows of your deeds. A few even received recognition in rare, astonishing circumstances, acts of bravery so undeniable that the rigid codes of knighthood had to yield, if only for a moment. The names faded. The tales became embellished or dismissed as legend. Knighthood was for men. At 14, he'd become a squire, training in riding, hunting, weapons, and the social etiquette of courts. He'd serve a knight directly, learning the rituals of armor and war. And perhaps, by 21, he would be dubbed a knight in a solemn ceremony surrounded by banners, incense, and the murmurs of Latin prayers. A boy of noble birth might begin his path at 7, sent to another lord's household as a page. The occasional entry in a tax roll or a court account. They risked ridicule, scandal, and in some cases, punishment, because to defy expectations was dangerous. But they did it anyway, for family, for survival, or simply for the belief that they could. A chronicler's aside, a note in the margin of a dusty book. But for a girl, an army approached. There was no formal path, no system, no ceremony. At best, you could ride and fight beside your husband in times of crisis. Still, some tried. Some trained in secret. Others fought in open defiance. But even when that happened, the records blurred. And so, what happened to female knights? More often than not, they were written out. We'll move from the mythic to the historical, from the battlefield to the forgotten chamber. We'll meet Joan, of course, but also many you may never have heard of. There are no sweeping histories of female chivalry, no proud genealogies passed down from one armored lady to another, only fragments, letters. What we have are whispers, and still, those whispers are enough to reconstruct a picture dimly lit, to be sure, but vivid in its quiet defiance. These women lived on the edge of what was allowed. In many cases, it wasn't even about glory. It was about necessity. A castle must be held. A husband was gone, and so a woman picked up a sword. She gave orders. She made a stand. And when the chroniclers came, they didn't always know what to do with her. Some were impressed, some confused, others simply left her out. Now, as we continue through this night's journey, we'll uncover some of those hidden stories. So let us keep walking this quiet path, through creaking halls and candlelit towers, where armored women once stood in shadows, half remembered, but never completely lost. Joan of Arc, visions, armor, and fire, the tragic and misunderstood biography of a most famous female knight. Imagine yourself again, this time not in a noble hall or riding ground, but in a small stone village, tucked away in the northeastern countryside of France. The year is 1412, and the 100 Years' War has already raged for decades. It is a time of uncertainty, fear, and prayers whispered into the smoky dark. The village of Domremy is quiet, almost forgettable. Cows graze slowly in muddy fields. The church bell tolls gently at dawn, and the people here, simple folk, mostly live lives that revolve around the rhythm of the seasons and the will of distant kings. There are no castles here, no great tournaments, no knights in shining armor, barely into her teens. Her name, Jean, you may know her better as Joan, and yet, this is where her story begins. She could not read or write, but what she had was conviction, unshakable, unrelenting conviction rooted in something she believed was divine. A young girl, she cut her hair short and donned men's clothing. Her banner white, with the names of Jesus and Mary embroidered upon it, was held aloft at the front lines. And all the while, she claimed her guidance came not from generals or kings, but from her saints. Not to kill, she said, but to lead. Along the way, she was dismissed, ridiculed, and questioned. But something about her was undeniable. Her confidence, her calm, her clarity. She was determined to speak not with nobles or knights, but directly with the heir to the throne. She would later describe them as messages from Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. They spoke to her, she said. She was sold to the English and placed on trial, not for treason, but for heresy, the charge that carried the greatest weight, wearing men's clothing, claiming divine communication, stepping beyond her station, not in metaphor, but with clarity. They told her she had a mission, that she was chosen, that she must lead France to victory. It was a masterful answer, simple, faithful, and entirely unassailable. She was questioned endlessly, pressed to recant, tricked, and manipulated, and yet she rarely faltered. She was not born into privilege or trained in the arts of war. As the story goes, Joan began hearing voices around the age of 13. It's easy now to romanticize that idea, but imagine being a peasant girl in an era where women could not inherit thrones, could not preach, and certainly could not lead armies. This second court exonerated her entirely, declared her innocent, declared her trial corrupt, declaimed divine inspiration as a reason for military command. That was not brave. It was unthinkable. Bound, surrounded by clergy, soldiers, and a confused public. Her banner had been taken from her, her armor stripped away, and in its place a rough dress. But she believed. But what's often overlooked in this veneration is the quiet, relentless truth of her story. She was not wealthy. She had no formal authority. Her memory refused to disappear, and she persisted, from a singular icon to a collective tale. Because Joan of Arc was not the only woman to raise a sword in defense of her city. At 16, she left her village and traveled first to the local garrison commander, then to court, eventually making her way to the Dauphin of France, the future Charles VII. And she did. Against all odds, She was granted armor, a horse, and command though limited over a group of troops. By 1429, Joan had become the center of an extraordinary moment in French history. She lifted the siege of Orleans. She marched alongside armies. She inspired victories where there had only been stagnation. To the French, she was a miracle. To the English, she was a threat. To the Church, she was a complication. Eventually, she was captured not on a battlefield, but in the quiet aftermath of a skirmish near Compiègne. The trial was long, and it was brutal. Her judges were not impartial. Her testimony was recorded painstakingly, giving us one of the most detailed medieval trial records in existence. At one point, when asked if she believed she was in God, "That's grace," a trick question meant to trap her, she replied, "If I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may God so keep me." Still, the outcome was all but decided. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was led to the stake in the marketplace at Rouen. She was just 19 years old. The fire was lit, and with it, the Church sought to erase the symbol she had become. But something strange happened in the years that followed. 25 years later, a retrial was held, called for by the very king she had helped to crown. Centuries passed, and in time, Joan of Arc became not a heretic, but a saint. She was canonized in 1920 by the Catholic Church, almost 500 years after her death. Today, she is remembered as France's greatest heroine. She was not trained. She had only belief. And in a world built to exclude her, she walked into battle anyway. She was never formally knighted. And yet, few knights in history have done more. Let her memory linger now as we transition gently. In the next part of our journey, we'll explore a forgotten chapter, one that very nearly slipped from history's grasp. Let's walk softly now toward the shadowed memory of the Order of the Hatchet. The Lost Order of the Hatchet, the forgotten women of Catalonia who were knighted for their bravery, but then vanished from history. Imagine a quiet mountain city in northeastern Spain. The air is dry and warm, and the narrow streets wind between stone houses with red-tiled roofs, and the town is called Tortosa. Olive trees cast long shadows. A faint scent of rosemary and wood smoke drifts through the early evening breeze. It is the year 1149. At the time, the Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula are locked in the long, grinding campaign known as the Reconquista, effort to reclaim territory from Muslim rule. The soldiers would be summoned, the city walls manned, but this siege takes an unexpected turn. Town by town, fortress by fortress, and in this complex web of faith, politics, and power, Tortosa has become a prize. Panic begins to ripple through the stone alleyways. This particular year, the city is under siege. The attackers are not distant invaders, but nearby enemies, forces loyal to Count Ramon Berenguer IV of Barcelona, seeking to retake the town from the Almoravid rulers who currently control it. Now, normally in a siege like this, the men would take up arms because the men of Tortosa are absent, outnumbered, scattered, or perhaps already fallen. They cannot defend their city. The gates are under threat. The enemy is approaching. And this is when something remarkable happens. The women of Tortosa, mothers, daughters, elderly widows, sisters, do not flee. They do not plead. And when the count eventually arrived to take possession of Tortosa, he was astonished. They shout warnings from the towers and pour fire upon their enemies. They fight not in desperation, but with unity. They arm themselves. They were awarded noble status. They were exempt from taxes. They were given the same rights and dignities as male knights, including the right to be called to war, with axes, with stones, with boiling oil. No mockery, no patronizing. These were not symbolic gestures. These were real honors, extended by a ruling noble to women who had demonstrated battlefield valor. There are no later records of its continuation, no mentions of younger members being inducted, no documents of their participation in later battles, with whatever they can find. Others believe it simply died out, its members growing old, with no mechanism for renewal. They climb the battlements, they guard the gates. According to legend, their defense was so fierce, so unexpectedly effective, that the attackers were driven off. The city was saved, but the individual women, their names are almost entirely lost. It is said that Count Ramon Berenguer deeply moved by the valor he witnessed, did something extraordinary, something virtually unheard of in medieval Europe. He created a female order of knighthood. It was called the Order of the Hatchet, Ordo de la Hatchet in the Old Catalan tongue. Shopkeepers, wives, seamstresses, and when the walls were threatened, they became warriors. Each woman who had taken part in the defense was granted this singular honor. And the symbol of their order, a hatchet, simple, unadorned, but powerful. The ceremony, as described in sparse medieval accounts, was solemn and deeply respectful. Let the torches fade behind us and the olive groves sway once more. We will carry this memory with us as we travel northward, toward another strange tale, one not of battle, but of law, given status, recognized in their own time. But here's where the story darkens, because after the initial celebration, after the songs and the proclamations, the Order of the Hatchet fades into obscurity. It vanishes. Historians debate what happened. Some suggest the order was intentionally suppressed, perhaps deemed improper, or threatening to establish gender roles. The documents that do exist, kept in fragments in Catalonian archives, speak to its existence. No biographies, no heraldry, no descendants boasting the honor. Just a single moment in time, recorded in careful medieval script, then left to gather dust. And yet, even in that silence, their story echoes. They were not noble women trained from birth. They were not saints or mythic figures. They were townsfolk. Unlike Joan of Arc, they were formally knighted. And yet, unlike Joan, they were forgotten. There is something quietly tragic in that erasure, because it wasn't war or plague that ended the Order of the Hatchet. It was memory, the slow erosion of interest, the reluctance to preserve a story that didn't fit the dominant narrative. But we can preserve it now, even here, in the quiet shadows of a sleepy bedtime story. Their hatchets still gleam, if only faintly. Let us leave the walls of Tortosa now, gently, because in the next segment, we uncover a surprising truth in parts of medieval Europe. Some laws actually allowed and protected women who chose to fight, and yet, even with those protections, most chose another path. Why? Let's take that journey together. How many evil law codes sometimes granted women the right to bear arms, and why few of them did? Let's journey now into the quiet corridors of medieval law, where parchment scrolls crackle with the ink of forgotten decisions, and gender norms were sometimes more flexible than we might imagine. Contrary to the popular image of rigid, unbending patriarchy, the legal landscape of the Middle Ages, especially between the 11th and 14th centuries, was more textured and inconsistent than we often assume. In small towns, borderlands, and duchies from France to Scandinavia, rules about who could fight, who could inherit armor, and who could lead were far from uniform. Buried within a handful of legal commentaries, we find references that women, in very particular circumstances, could bear arms. Let's begin in medieval France, in a time when the legal system was shaped by both feudal custom and evolving Roman traditions. One such allowance, in cases of feudal necessity, his widow or eldest daughter inherits not only his lands, but his responsibilities, and that included, legally, the right to defend her estate, with armed force if needed. If a woman held lands in her own right or was the temporary guardian of a male heir, she had legal standing to gather troops, raise militia, and even ride into battle in defense of her feudal obligations. The land in question had to be under direct attack, and the woman in question had to be either noble-born or legally tied to the estate, through blood or marriage, in certain emergencies, such as the defense of family land or during siege conditions. Women were explicitly permitted to wield weapons and even command troops. Picture this: a nobleman dies unexpectedly, perhaps in a skirmish or from illness. His lands and castle are left without a male heir. This was especially common in border territories like Gascony, or the Low Countries, where war was never far off and loyalties shifted like fog on the moor. In these regions, the law often provided what was known as custodial defense. Even when the law allowed it, social norms didn't encourage it. The church was often deeply uncomfortable with women taking up arms, especially outside strict feudal necessity. Canon law reinforced the idea that women's virtue was tied to passivity, humility, and obedience, A woman who raised a sword risked not only scandal, but accusations of sin. A woman in armor was often seen as unnatural, an aberration, something to be tolerated only in extremity. These were not acts of rebellion, they were duties. Let us travel a little farther north, to the Holy Roman Empire, where some Saxon law codes granted women a curious sort of legal parity, at least in theory. For a woman to be properly equipped required not only resources, but a blacksmith willing to make something unconventional. This wasn't always easy to find or fund, but these permissions came with strict conditions. The threat had to be imminent, even if a woman successfully defended her land or led troops during a siege. There was no guarantee of honor. Let the torches burn low, because in our next segment, we will visit the heart of chivalric legend, not to find men like Lancelot or Gawain, but to seek the women warriors. Buried within those very tales, no promise of knighthood. In fact, in many cases, her contributions were quietly minimized, omitted from the chronicle, or assigned to a male cousin or steward. In practice, these laws created a narrow path, but a path nonetheless through which women could become protectors, guardians, and yes, knights of a sort. And yet, here's the paradox. Despite these legal permissions, few women actually chose to take up arms. Why? Some of the reasons are quietly heartbreaking. 1. Cultural pressure. 2. Clerical opposition. 3. Physical constraints. Armor was expensive and typically custom-fitted to male frames. And though the records may be brief, we know she stood there. And finally, 4. Consequences. And so, despite these legal doorways, most women chose another path. Instead of leading troops, they became strategists. Instead of fighting on horseback, they managed supplies. Instead of being written into history, they worked in its shadows. But once in a while, the path was taken. A woman inherited land. She donned her husband's armor. She took her place on the battlements, sword in hand, silent, watchful, unyielding. Let's step quietly away now from the parchment, scrolls of law, tales of courage, of disguised identities, of forbidden duels. Tales that whisper the truth, even through the veil of romance. The shield maidens of the north, warrior women of the Norse world, you awaken to the sound of seagulls, echoing over distant fjords. The salty sting of northern sea air filling your lungs as you sit upright on a bed of woolen pelts. Outside your longhouse, smoke curls into the morning mist. The cold wind whistles softly through carved wooden beams, and you hear the clink of iron tools being sharpened, axes ready. Somewhere close by, a low chant rises, a song of courage, of death, of Valhalla, and the rune stones of ancient kings. There's another story, lesser told but no less powerful, that of the women who stood in the shield wall, those who led raids, settled disputes, and sometimes ruled with iron and wisdom. You are not a noble, nor a seer, nor even a man. You are a woman of the north, and today you ride to war. Welcome to the world of the shield maidens. While history often speaks in the voices of men, whispered along the axes of Viking raiders, this is the story of the Norse shield maidens and of the blurry line between myth, memory, and battlefield reality. Let us begin this slow and sleepy but deeply immersive journey into what it may have truly been like to be a warrior woman in the Viking world. The legend of the shield maiden, the image of a tall, blonde-haired woman in a ring mailcoat, sword in hand, and hair braided in ritual fashion, standing shoulder to shoulder with bearded raiders, has long captured the imagination. They could inherit property, divorce abusive husbands, and control their own dowries. Some became merchants, landowners, and even chieftains in their own right. Names like Lagertha, Brynhildr, and Hervor appear, wielding weapons, commanding respect, and defying gender norms. Marriage was political, childbirth was dangerous, and mortality was high. Physical labor was intense. A woman was expected to run the farm, raise children, and preserve the household while her husband raided or traded abroad. Shield maidens, fierce women of the north, are often pictured as living contradictions, beautiful yet deadly, maternal yet brutal, living within a patriarchal society yet defying its expectations. Because Norse women were already known for their independence and tenacity, it wasn't too far-fetched for some to step onto the battlefield. But were they real? buried in full military regalia with a sword, axe, spear, arrows, shield, and to sacrificed horses. The grave showed all the hallmarks of a professional warrior. In the Gesta Danorum, a 12th century Danish chronicle by Saxo Grammaticus, she's described as a courageous woman who fought in male attire, her hair flowing behind her, cutting through enemy lines. Saxo, a Christian monk, was uncomfortable with these portrayals, but he couldn't deny them. The Norse sagas tell us they were. These medieval Icelandic narratives, rich with poetry, heroism, and the supernatural, offer multiple examples of female warriors. Lagertha, for instance, is said to have fought alongside the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. Shield walls, the foundational Norse battle strategy, required cohesion and stamina. One poorly trained fighter could open a fatal gap. Yet the sagas were written centuries after the Viking Age. Were these shield maidens historical figures, or literary constructs shaped by memory and myth? The sword was elite, often decorated with intricate runes or animal motifs. A helmet was rare and precious. Her shield would be round, wooden, and painted with personal or clan insignia. She was expected to embody bravery, honor, and duty to kin and gods. Axes were more common, sometimes sharpened on one end and blunted on the other for versatility. Bows were prized in hunting and warfare alike. This belief gave their warriors, women included, an eerie calm. A woman had been buried as a warrior, not just symbolically, but with the tools of leadership, battle, and power. This question haunts historians and archaeologists to this day. Critics argued it might be ceremonial, or the woman could have been placed there by mistake. But the layout of the grave, identical to high-ranking male warrior graves, challenged that assumption. To understand the place of the shield maiden, we must understand the role of women in Viking society, a culture both surprisingly progressive and firmly patriarchal. Viking women had far more rights than their medieval European counterparts, but they also lived within a world structured by strength, hierarchy, and bloodlines. This societal position, strong yet bounded, set the foundation for the shield maiden myth, and some, perhaps, truly did. For decades, scholars dismissed the shield maidens as literary fantasies. That changed in 2017. On the Swedish island of Björk, in the Viking trading town of Birka, a high-status warrior-esque grave, known as BJ 581, had long been assumed to belong to a man. But DNA analysis revealed something unexpected. The bones were female. This wasn't simply a case of mislabeling. The skeletal structure, the mitochondrial DNA, all confirmed it. The academic world paused. The Birka warrior woman became the first archaeological evidence to possibly confirm the historical existence of shield maidens. If a woman were to fight, how would she prepare? Training likely mirrored that of male warriors, swordsmanship, archery, use of the axe and spear, and shield techniques. Weapons were not just tools but symbols. Clothing, likely a tunic or male shirt if the family could afford it, over thick woolen garments. And mentally, the Norse believed deeply in fate, or word. If it was your time to die, nothing could stop it. A shield maiden didn't just wield weapons. No discussion of Norse warrior women is complete without mentioning the Valkyries, mythical figures who chose the slain in battle and served Odin in Valhalla. But Valkyries were more than divine agents. In many texts, they are romantic, tragic, and warrior-like figures, often blending into the human world. Brynhildr, for example, is a famous Valkyria who defies Odin, is punished to live as a mortal, and becomes a central character in the Volsunga saga. Her story blends myth, heroism, and tragedy, all while preserving the image of a powerful, self-willed woman with a sword. The line between shield maiden and Valkyria is thin, perhaps. Shield maidens were inspired by Valkyries, or maybe, for those who lived and fought, the myth became a form of social permission, a narrative framework that made such lives possible. Were shield maidens truly present in battle? The sagas and chronicles say yes. Shield maidens reportedly fought at Bravelar, at the Battle of Clontarf, and even in the Siege of Paris. One 10th century account even describes a Rus Viking funeral, in which a slave woman is ritually killed after taking on the persona of a warrior. Some stories describe entire companies of women warriors. Others show them as singular figures, leading, healing, or avenging. Whether these accounts were literal or symbolic remains debated. But they all reflect one truth: the warrior woman was a rare concept in the Viking imagination, and that alone is telling. Not all Viking-era women wielded swords. In Iceland, several landowning women hosted legal assemblies on their estates, settling disputes and shaping local policy. And the northern wind howls softly across the fjords, as though whispering the forgotten sagas of women who took up arms. Let us delve deeper still into stories, hidden beneath layers of saga embellishment and archaeological silence. For while the tales of Viking shield maidens often arrive shrouded in myth, their echoes linger in burial mounds, combed through by cautious scholars and captivated dreamers alike. His description of shield maidens is often framed as a moral lesson: women abandoning their proper domestic roles and suffering the consequences. This tension leaves modern historians torn between viewing his accounts as tantalizing truth or religiously motivated fiction. Some held influence in subtler, no less potent ways. Navalva, or Cirrus, was a respected mystic who used prophecy and ritual to guide decisions. His magnum opus, Gesta Danorum, the Deeds of the Danes, is a sprawling compilation of semi-legendary history. The academic world exploded. Could this be the physical evidence of a true shield maiden? In it, Saxo references numerous female warriors, women like Lagertha, Hetha, Wisna, and many others who fought valiantly alongside male warriors. Others pointed out the lack of injuries on the bones that might indicate combat, but others countered, not all warriors die in battle, and status alone could have justified the grave goods. No longer is the shield maiden only the domain of sagas and fantasy. These women often dressed in elaborate garments, carried staffs, and were believed to speak with spirits and gods. You wake on a raised wooden bed, covered in furs and woolen blankets. Boats bob in the harbor. Smoke rises from the hearths. Children chase each other through the frost. You are not simply a warrior, you are also a smith's daughter, or perhaps a farmer's sister. Your duties are as varied as your training. You feel a kinship with them, not only as stories, but as reflections of your own battle with the world's expectations. Your hair is long but tied back in practicality, around your waist. A belt holds your small utility knife, something no Norse person goes without, even if she never drew blood on the battlefield. Her community viewed her as a warrior worthy of honor and distinction, and hers is not the only case. Other women became gogi, chieftain priests who managed laws and rituals. By midday, you may be sparring with wooden shields or sharpening blades. Your muscles ache, but it's a familiar soreness. You are respected by some, doubted by others, but your sword is sharp, and your spirit sharper. Would he go to such elaborate lengths describing female warriors if the idea hadn't existed in the cultural memory of the Norse? After all, it contained a full array of weapons: a sword, an axe, a spear, armor-piercing arrows, a knife, and even to horses buried beside the occupant, a common signifier of a mounted warrior of great repute. Whether real, embellished, or allegorical, the shield maiden was clearly part of the Viking worldview. In this way, even off the battlefield, women exercised a kind of leadership that mirrored the values of the shield maiden: clarity, courage, and control. By now, the fire of the hall is nothing but a glowing bed of embers. The Saxo Grammaticus controversy, warrior women in doubt, one of the most cited sources in the conversation about Viking warrior women is the 12th century Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus. But Saxo had an agenda. Writing from a Christian viewpoint during a time of transformation across Scandinavia, he disapproved of the earlier, pagan society's gender dynamics. Still, even in Saxo's bias, there may lie the trace of a genuine phenomenon: burials of honor, excavating. The evidence few archaeological discoveries have shaken the scholarly world like the Birka warrior grave in Sweden. Unearthed in the 1880s, the grave was initially assumed to belong to a high-status male warrior. For over a century, it was accepted as such until modern DNA testing in 2017 confirmed the remains belonged to a biological female. Not all scholars accepted the conclusion so easily. Some question whether the weapons belonged to her or were ceremonial. Still, the Burqa warriors shook centuries of assumption. Several other graves have since been revisited and re-examined with new scientific methods, leading to a gradual shift in how we view gender roles in Viking Age Scandinavia. A day in the life of a shield maiden. Let's imagine, for a moment, that you are a shield maiden in a Viking settlement on the edge of the Northern Sea. Your morning begins with the sound of gulls and the scent of salt air. Outside, the settlement is alive with activity. You help carry water from the nearby stream, then join your kin in repairing armor or fleshing arrows. When the Jarls call for volunteers for a raid or a defense, you are among the first to step forward. At night, by firelight, you listen to the skalds sing tales of goddesses like Freyja and warriors like Brynhildr. The Valkyria, Valkyries in myth, the divine parallel. We cannot discuss shield maidens without acknowledging their mythic counterparts, the Valkyries. In Norse mythology, Valkyries were female beings who served Odin, choosing who would live and die in battle. They were fearsome, divine, and respected, though they did not fight themselves in every account. Their presence on the battlefield was symbolic. They represented the sacred, often tragic role of warrior fate. Did young girls, inspired by tales of Valkyries, choose to become shield maidens? Perhaps. Like saints built around martyrs, the Valkyries are a mythic reflection of flesh and blood shield maidens long forgotten. Did society, in turn, elevate these women by linking them to divine protectors? Over time, the lines blurred between myth and reality. A woman who could hold her own in a fight, especially in isolated communities where survival was paramount, wasn't necessarily seen as unnatural. In fact, Norse law codes reveal that women could own property, initiate divorce, and command households. Some even suggest that the idea of the Valkyria emerged in part to explain or mythologize real warrior women of the past. Gender roles in Norse society more flexible than you'd think. One reason shield maidens could exist in the first place is the relatively flexible gender structure of Norse culture compared to the rest of medieval Europe. While patriarchal, Viking society valued contribution over conformity. Norse combat emphasized defense, coordination, and group movement. Shield maidens likely trained in the shield wall, standing shoulder to shoulder, locking shields into a wall of defense. Strength mattered, but endurance, timing, and strategy were just as critical. That's a harder question. In fact, defensive roles such as holding a longhouse during attack could easily involve female defenders, who became warriors out of necessity. Freydis, sister to Leif Erikson, traveled to North America during the Norse expeditions to Vinland. When the Norse camp was attacked by native peoples, the men began to retreat, but Freydis remained. In awe of the deep-minded, a respected settler and leader in Iceland. In one version, she massacres her own crew to cover up betrayal. In another, she's a stalwart leader. Either way, she was no ordinary woman, and her story has endured 1,000 winters. Saga literature, too, features fierce women. Queen Gunhildr of Norway, Freydis Eiriksdottir, the wild-tempered sister of Leif Erikson. Battle skill was learned through participation, mentorship, and necessity. And behind the dramatization, a quiet truth begins to reform, that women in the Viking Age were more than passive figures. If a shield maiden came from a warrior family, she may have trained alongside her brothers from childhood. These were not merely exceptions. They point to a cultural space, however small, where women could seize authority, particularly in times of war or absence of men. And young women, standing before the reconstructed longhouses of Denmark or Sweden, ask what their role might have been in a time when courage meant more than conformity. Training for battle. How would a shield maiden learn to fight? Was there a formal system for training? Sagas written during this Christian era often portrayed female warriors with suspicion, or as tragic figures undone by ambition. Most Viking warriors did not undergo standardized military training like Roman legions or later medieval knights. Weaponry would include the sword, the axe, the spear, and perhaps more importantly, the shield. Some women may have trained with archery, particularly if they guarded settlements. One of the more infamous tales comes from the saga of the Greenlanders. Heavily pregnant and unarmed, she grabbed a dead man's sword and exposed her breast to the enemy, screaming defiance. The Attackers fled. Was it fear of her madness? The unfamiliarity of female aggression? Or was it, as the saga intended, a symbol of unbreakable will? Freydis is often cast as both heroine and villain, depending on which saga you read. The fading of the Shield Maiden, decline in the Christian era, as Scandinavia converted to Christianity and adopted more rigid European gender norms. The Shield Maiden all but disappeared from historical record. The once flexible expectations of women gave way to ecclesiastical control, domestic confinement, and moral restrictions. The Valkyria, too, was transformed from a divine warrior into a symbol of doomed love or spiritual purity. And yet, traces of the Shield Maiden live on in folklore, in the subconscious of Norse descendants, and now in modern media and scholarship that seeks to resurrect the lost echoes. Today, Shield Maidens inspire a new generation through literature, television, historical reenactment, and academic research, while the Vikings TV series or fantasy portrayals like those in The Witcher or Game of Thrones dramatize the warrior woman, they also invite renewed curiosity. They were landowners, explorers, healers, and yes, on occasion warriors. Museums now recategorize graves, scholars revisit runestones, filmmakers retell sagas with fresh eyes. One thing is clear, whether Shield Maidens fought in dozens, hundreds, or only in legend, their legacy is woven into the long tapestry of human courage and defiance. Sleep now, if you will, under the watchful eyes of those ancient daughters of frost and fire. The axe rests. The shield is lowered, but the saga never ends. In the fading glow of torches flickering against stone walls, a ceremony once took place unlike any other in medieval Europe. There were no squires kneeling before armored men, no booming proclamations of kings or high clergy. Instead, this ritual was held for a group of women battle-hardened, smoke-streaked, bruised, and bloodied who had defended their city with as much valor and viciousness as any knight in Christendom. These women, unflinchingly brave, had earned something nearly unthinkable in the rigidly gendered codes of medieval chivalry, knighthood. Welcome to the tale of the Order of the Hatchet, one of the rare and extraordinary instances in history where a group of women were formally recognized, not only for their courage in war, but with actual honors and privileges typically reserved only for men. This segment dives deep into their story, and far beyond it, exploring how they came to be, what made this order so rare, and why history chose to forget them. The Siege of Perelada, Catalonia's fiery defiance. To understand the Order of the Hatchet, one must journey back to the year 1149 to the besieged town of Perelada, nestled in the region of Catalonia in present-day Spain. Not swords or lances, but axes, hatchets, boiling oil, and makeshift weapons, they hurled stones, poured scalding water, and set fire to siege engines, according to the few chronicles that survive. They fought not only with fury, but with strategic brilliance, holding the city long enough for help to arrive and the attackers to withdraw. They were bakers, cloth workers, mothers, and nuns. Many had never seen a battlefield, yet found themselves thrust into one and rose with ferocity that rivaled seasoned soldiers. The city's men were off fighting elsewhere, leaving Perelada vulnerable. History, as it so often does, recorded the deeds but not the names of the women behind them. We know them only through fragments, a mention in legal documents, a note in a bishop's ledger, an entry in a tax record exempting them from duties. For just a moment in history, these women broke the mold. When the enemy forces encroached, the town seemed doomed. Some may have been noble women who'd seen their estates plundered, others peasant women who refused to let their homes be burned. Together, they made up a rare kind of malicious spontaneous, grassroots force of resistance led not by duty but desperation. But the story took a turn no chronicle could have predicted. At that time, Perelada found itself under threat from the army of Count Ramon Berenguer of Barcelona. It was the women who rallied to defend the walls, led by Countess Ermesinda of Perelada, a noblewoman of iron will and extraordinary courage. The women of the town took up arms. Their stand was so exceptional, so impossible by the standards of the day, that when the city was saved, Count Berenguer impressed beyond measure issued an extraordinary edict, the formation of the Order of the Hatchet, Ordo de la Hatchet. Who were these women? From domestic to defensive, the name is likely a reference to the very tools the women used in their improvised defense. It perfectly captured the transformation of the everyday woman into an unexpected warrior. The naming preserved the uniqueness of their role and reinforced their departure from the expected feminine path. Where knights fought with swords and lances, these women wielded kitchen tools and firewood axes. But symbolically, their induction into this order placed them on a similar pedestal. But the truth is more sobering, from the Carolingian reforms to the codes of chivalry under knights like William Marshall. Martial virtue was a male domain. The women honored by this order were not trained warriors. Their names have been lost to time. Upon marrying, a woman effectively disappeared from civic life. It was a blip, an anomaly that happened because the town had no other choice and because the women succeeded. This caveat reveals how temporary and conditional female agency was. Even when hard-won through bloodshed, they likely ranged in age, background, and social standing. What they accomplished was more than military. It was cultural. The privileges of knighthood, with a catch as a reward. The women of the Order of the Hatchet were granted lifetime privileges traditionally reserved for knights and elite men, exemption from taxes, right to wear distinctive dress denoting their honorary rank. No copycat orders emerged. No rulers attempted to extend the model. Once the moment passed, the women faded back into obscurity. Special legal protections, public recognition, and ceremony, they were not officially knights. In the traditional feudal sense, no land was granted, and they didn't serve in further military campaigns. Still, these honors had a catch. The privileges were extended only while they remained unmarried. Marriage, in the eyes of the medieval order, transferred a woman's identity and legal standing to her husband. The meaning behind the name, why hatchet? Why hatchet? In medieval symbolism, the hatchet was not a traditional weapon of war, it was domestic, utilitarian. The hatchet was a symbol of subversion, turning the tools of domesticity into weapons of rebellion. This name also ensured the women would never be mistaken for part of the regular chivalric orders. They were honored, but they remained other. Why was this order so rare? It is tempting to think that there might have been many more such orders that simply didn't make it into historical records. Medieval society was constructed around the rigid exclusion of women from combat roles. The Order of the Hatchet stands out precisely because it broke with every norm. Women did not traditionally fight in open battle. They did not hold titles for valor. They were not usually recognized, publicly or legally, for their military efforts. The fact that this order was recorded at all is a testament to just how extraordinary the situation was. This rarity also explains why the order was never replicated elsewhere. The silence surrounding the Order of the Hatchet is deafening. Most people, even history buffs, have never heard of it. Why? Medieval chroniclers were overwhelmingly male and elite. They had little interest in preserving stories that disrupted traditional gender roles. Ecclesiastical authorities, who dominated writing and archiving, disapproved of female martial activity. The order had no succession. It did not evolve into a lasting institution. Over time, Paralotta's importance waned, and with it, the memory of its women's resistance. Later retellings of knightly history would sanitize the story of chivalry into a male-only tale of gallantry, even where women were involved, as in the Crusades or as camp followers. They were relegated to passive roles. The Order of the Hatchet didn't fit this narrative, so it was quietly excised. Despite the uniqueness of the Order of the Hatchet, there are tantalizing hints of other women who fought and were perhaps similarly honored but never recorded. In Bohemia, there are legends of noble women who led militia forces. In France, the story of Jeanne d'Arc, a later female defender of Beauvais in 1472, bears striking resemblance to Paralotta's tale. Oral histories and folk traditions may hold more than we suspect. It is as rare as it is fascinating. In Ireland, Grace O'Malley, the 16th century pirate queen, exercised martial power and was granted status by the English crown. Could these be echoes of a broader, unofficial tradition of female resistance? It's possible, but the Order of the Hatchet remains the only official chivalric institution created exclusively for women, honoring their martial deeds. The Order of the Hatchet, despite being real, remains in the shadows. In recent years, the Order of the Hatchet has seen renewed interest. feminist historians, and scholars of gender. And medieval studies have begun referencing it in academic texts. Local Catalonian museums and cultural festivals occasionally honor the women of Paralata. Historical fiction authors have used the story as inspiration for fictional orders and characters. Still, its profile remains limited. There are no statues, no Netflix dramas, no public monuments. It is a reminder of how fragile historical memory is, especially when it comes to those who challenge norms. This story offers profound lessons not just about warfare, but about the contingency of recognition, how quickly it can vanish, the brittleness of social roles. When survival is on the line, the power of communal resistance, especially among those underestimated. And most of all, the cost of being forgotten when one does not fit the dominant narrative. For those interested in the buried corners of history, The Order of the Hatchet is a treasure trove, a chapter that rewrites what we thought we knew about gender, power, and resistance. You blink into the smoke-filled interior of a felt walger. As your grandmother finishes tying up the final knot on your heavy silk deal, she does not look at you as she tightens the final loop on your sash. Only mutters a blessing for protection, for courage, and for a strong hand when the arrows begin to fly. You aren't just someone's daughter now. You are a shield in the wall, another rider on the horizon. The women of your lineage have all borne arms not only for pride, but for necessity. For the Mongol Empire, women were not mere supporters of war, they were sometimes its very engine. Fire spirits were female, and women were believed to be the keepers of these sacred flames. Offending a woman was not just a social error, it was a spiritual violation. The spiritual power of the hearth keeper. To understand the true position of women in Mongol society, one must return to the central structure of their nomadic lives, the yurt or jur. It wasn't unusual for a woman to sit in a diplomatic council, sometimes as the final voice of authority in her husband's absence. At the heart of every jur sat the hearth, and the hearth was the realm of the woman. Their leadership was not ceremonial. It was real, recognized, and, in many cases, revered. From this symbolic center radiated domestic power that often extended beyond the home and into the sphere of clan leadership and decision-making. In Mongol belief systems, an elegant mix of shamanism, animism, and later Buddhism, women were linked deeply with spirits, fire, and continuity. When her husband died early, she did not simply become a widow, she became the empire's backbone. But it wasn't just her motherhood that mattered. Sorgatani maneuvered with incredible political dexterity, aligning herself with merchants, administrators. She protected her realm not just with force, but with diplomacy. The chronicler Adamalik Javani, a Persian historian, praised her as the most intelligent woman among the Mongols, and religious leaders to ensure that her sons inherited power in an empire where family alliances were everything. She even arranged for the execution of political opponents and brought loyal allies into high positions. They were part of a system in which women's power was recognized, especially during moments of vulnerability in the imperial hierarchy. Mongol queens had political muscles, and they flexed them. Archaeological evidence, including burial sites with bows and armor interred alongside female remains, confirms that some women fought. Mongol tactics centered on mobility, archery, and endurance suited the already physically capable women of the steppe. Women learned to ride before they could walk steadily and trained with bows from a young age. These were not ceremonial burials. These women likely trained for combat and participated in actual battles. Her reign wasn't passive or symbolic, it was active governance. She might marry into a different clan, but her herd was hers. This level of marital flexibility allowed women to navigate personal and political relationships with more leverage than their counterparts in Europe or the Middle East. This property autonomy created a cushion of independence that, in turn, enabled decision-making within families. These women participated in ceremonies to call upon nature spirits, ancestors, and deities for guidance, fertility, weather, and warfare. In fact, even the layout of the jur reflected this ideology. Women's spiritual authority was a real and lasting feature of Mongol society. Men entered to the left and occupied the western side. Women kept to the right, the eastern half associated with life-giving and dawn. Their importance in community life elevated them beyond the typical domestic roles associated with women in many ancient cultures. While this division may seem limiting to modern eyes, it served as a symbolic framework that honored both domains. In more Islamic-leaning regions, female political power was gradually curtailed, and educate their children with the stories of their great-grandmothers, who once rode with banners flying. Religious conservatism, foreign influences, and administrative changes reduced the space Mongol women once commanded. You could have governed your clan from within a felt-walled home, carrying both your infant child and the burden of statecraft, and presence in public spaces stood out in contrast to more rigid patriarchal structures nearby. Women's side was not lesser, it was sacred. When the men rode off, the women took over a horn sound somewhere on the edge of camp. You are not just a daughter or a wife. You are a daughter of the steppe, a sister of warriors. And history, whether it remembered you or not, was once shaped by your hand. While this may sound like legend, such stories were consistent with cultural norms that allowed for female resilience and leadership in crisis. In a society as militaristic and expansionist as the Mongols, the absence of men was routine. Elite women, especially, could refuse suitors or negotiate terms of alliance. Dowries were customary, and women retained control of their personal property even after marriage. But the women behind them often held de facto power, especially in times of transition. For instance, Tregin Khatun, wife of Genghis Khan, ruled the empire as regent after her husband's death. Seasonal raids, conquests, diplomatic journeys, and hunting parties could remove husbands, brothers, and fathers for months, even years. In these times, women stepped into roles that other societies would consider solely masculine. Women became administrators of entire clans. They managed herds, negotiated with other clans, arranged marriages, oversaw spiritual rituals, and arbitrated disputes. This level of involvement ensured that Mongol women developed political literacy. They could read the room, understand power dynamics, and act as intermediaries between tribes. Sorgatani Beki, the empress who forged an empire. Among the most influential of all Mongol women was Sorgatani Beki, a name that today should be whispered with the same weight as Genghis Khan himself. A Karaite princess by birth, Sorgatani married Tolui, the youngest son of Genghis Khan. She raised 4 sons who would become khans in their own right, including Kublai Khan, the most famous Mongol ruler in China. She cultivated loyalty through generosity, patronized scholars, and even learned multiple languages, ensuring she could communicate across the empire's vast territory. Underneath her robes was an iron will and the ability to outmatch men at their own game. Mongol queens and political succession after Genghis Khan's death. His successors' sons and grandsons ruled vast territories. She held onto power for 5 years, maintaining order and exercising direct control while her son, Gaik, prepared to take the throne. These regencies weren't brief anomalies. Military participation, more than a myth though not all Mongol women wielded weapons, many did. Accounts from foreign observers, such as the chroniclers of Rus or China, noted the presence of women archers and horse riders. There are even battlefield anecdotes like that of a Mongol princess who defended her caravan from a rival clan's ambush using a composite bow while shouting orders to retainers. Marriage, autonomy, and power marriage among the Mongols was complex. While arranged unions were the norm, consent was not always absent. In fact, among pastoral nomads, a woman's herd was her economic security. Divorce was also not taboo. A woman could return to her father's clan and take her possessions with her. The role of women in Mongol religion and mysticism in the shamanistic traditions of the Mongols, female shamans, or Ugin, held respected roles as spiritual guides, healers, and intermediaries between the living and the spirit world. They wielded ritual drums, wore feathered headdresses, and entered trances to commune with invisible forces. Some even advised khans directly, even after Buddhism gained prominence in the empire. Female religious figures retained influence sometimes even as patrons of monasteries or as nuns. Children of the sword, legacy, and decline as the Mongol Empire fragmented, and local khanates emerged such as the Yuan dynasty in China or the Ilkhanate in Persia. The status of women evolved. Still, the legacy of the steppe matriarchs remained. In remote areas, women continued to manage households, ride horseback, even centuries later. European travelers in Central Asia, noted the comparative freedom of Mongol-descended women, their movement, clothing. When women held the reins, so if you were born a daughter of the Mongol steppe, your life would have been wine-burned, chaotic, but not without power. You may have ridden to war beside your brothers. You may have married for alliance, but not without a say. You might have summoned spirits to protect your people or negotiated trade deals. Across the Silk Road, while most of the world was writing women out of the story, the Mongol Empire only briefly rode them into power. You breathe in the cold night air. Outside your jur, horses stir in the distance. Close your eyes and drift back with me across sand and time. Imagine warm winds sweeping across the sun-baked courtyards of medieval Damascus, or the shadowed marble colonnades of Baghdad. At the height of the Abbasid Caliphate, minarets rise toward the sky. Prayers drift like birdsong over spice-laden streets. And amid the golden glow of lamps burning fragrant oils, stories unfold that many have forgotten or perhaps never knew. Because behind the silken veils and beneath the layered robes of medieval Islamic courts and cities, some women carried swords, some led armies, some bled for causes greater than themselves. This isn't a fairy tale. There were empresses and tribal leaders, commanders and bodyguards. Some rode into battle veiled, others were unveiled, but no less veiled by the sands of forgotten time. We will trace their footsteps across empires of Umayyad, Abbasid, Fatimid, Mamluk, and Ottoman. From Arabia to North Africa, from Persia to the far edges of the steppes. This is history, gently unwrapped layer by layer like the folds of an embroidered hijab. Tonight, we'll leave behind the bustling markets and madrasas to travel softly through the little-known legacy of the Muslim world as female fighters. You'll meet warrior queens like Arwa al-Sulai of Yemen, Turkin Khatun of Khwarezm, and the fierce and mysterious Saida al-Hurra, the noble lady, a Moroccan pirate queen who defied Spanish ships and male expectations. You'll learn about women trained in the martial arts of self-defense, swordplay, and archery in Turkish palaces and Persian courts. You'll discover female Mamluks, yes, enslaved warriors, some of whom rose to astonishing heights. We'll even whisper the stories of those hidden in harems. Not idle captives, but political powerhouses trained to manipulate the chessboard of dynasties. Let's begin, gently and with curiosity, with the roots of it all. Before the rise of Islam, the Arabian Peninsula was a patchwork of tribal societies. These tribes were often in conflict, and while life was harsh, it was also surprisingly flexible when it came to the roles of women. Pre-Islamic poetry and oral tradition describe women who took up arms when needed, sometimes to defend their homes, sometimes to defend their honor, and occasionally to defend entire clans. Legend says Zarqa could see approaching enemies from days away. She warned her tribe, defended her land, and fought when necessary. While many of these stories are enshrouded in myth, they reveal the cultural space women held not as shrinking violets. She wasn't just a scholar and narrator of hadith, she also led troops into battle. During the Battle of the Camel, a pivotal confrontation during the first fitna, the first Islamic civil war, Aisha rode a camel at the head of her army, and though the conflict ended in her defeat, her boldness echoed through the centuries. The boundaries between faith, duty, and gender were still fluid, shaped more by context than rigid doctrine. She remains one of the most controversial and intriguing female figures in Islamic history. Women's roles shifted dramatically, especially in the elite. Women of the court, especially those in the harems, were often politically influential, but hidden from public life. However, this didn't mean they lacked power or even martial training, but as fierce protectors and participants in warfare when their world demanded it. They guarded caravans, rode horses, and protected their tribes. This contrast between the veiled court lady and the armed desert nomad creates a mosaic of female roles in the Islamic world that is anything but uniform. After her husband, the governor of Tetuan, died, she assumed leadership unheard of for a woman at the time. Many were enslaved or captured from the Caucasus or Central Asia and educated to serve the elite, yet some became wives, queens, or political advisors. She allied with Hayred Barbarossa, the Ottoman admiral, and launched pirate raids against Iberian ships. Her enemies dubbed her a menace. Her people called her sovereign. One of the most famous pre-Islamic figures was Alcansa, a poetess and a woman of such stirring rhetoric that even warriors wept at her words. The Khwarezmian Empire 1077 to 1231 CE, a Persianate Sunni Muslim dynasty, saw the rise of Turkin Khatun, a queen mother who essentially ruled behind the curtain, and is one of the only women in Islamic history to carry both political and naval power on such a scale. Her legacy underscores a crucial point in the Islamic world, especially in moments of political transition or crisis. Gender barriers were sometimes crossed, sometimes shattered by force of will and necessity. Within the shadowy walls of the palace, power was currency, and knowing how to defend oneself or assassinate quietly was a necessary skill, though not a fighter in the physical sense. Her defiant spirit laid the groundwork for the later ideal of women as spiritual warriors in Islamic culture. A fleet of ships bearing the crescent moon flag glides through dark waters. Sources suggest that no official documents were valid unless signed with her seal. She commanded military movements, led political negotiations, and was feared across the region. At the helm stands not a grizzled corsair, but a woman cloaked in black, Saida al-Hurra, the noble lady, feared by the Spanish, respected by the Ottomans, and largely forgotten by modern history, but as part of the spiritual and social upheaval that redefined community and responsibility. She might not have worn armor, but she wielded armies all the same. But others, like Zarqa al-Yamama, were literal warriors or at least portrayed as such in folklore. When Islam arrived in the 7th century, it both challenged and preserved these roles. The Prophet Muhammad's time offers perhaps one of the clearest records of women participating in battles not as anomalies. One of the most complex figures of this time is Aisha bint Abu Bakr, the Prophet's wife. She took part in the Battle of Uhud, wielding a sword and shielding Muhammad when the enemy forces broke through the Muslim lines. Her injuries were numerous, and she earned praise from the Prophet himself for her bravery. She was a healer and warrior both. Another was Nusayba bint Ka'b, one of the Prophet's companions. In this early Islamic period, women fought as defenders not in organized military units, but as part of the Ummah, the spiritual family. As the Islamic Empire expanded into a cosmopolitan civilization, stretching from Spain to Central Asia, the caliphates developed more rigid structures. The Abbasid era 7501 to 58 CE brought splendor, urban growth, and a complex court culture. Some court women, particularly the Jariya concubines trained in music, literature, and sometimes combat, became formidable influencers. There is strong evidence that some Jariya were also trained in archery, dagger use, and in armed combat, especially those assigned to protect royal children or rival queens. Outside the court, Bedouin and Berber women in the fringes of the empire maintained more traditional warrior roles. Saida al-Hurra, the pirate queen of Morocco, imagined now the wind off the Mediterranean. Stiff and brainy, born Lala Aika bint Ali ibn Rashid around 1485 in Granada. She fled Spain during the Reconquista and resettled in northern Morocco. She wasn't merely a figurehead, she commanded fleets. Saida al-Hurra held the title of queen, was politically recognized by the Sultan of Morocco, Turkin Khatun, and the Khwarezmian Empire, from wife to warlord. The Islamic East, especially in Persia and Central Asia, gave rise to a different kind of warrior woman, one shaped by nomadic traditions and the turbulence of empire. Turkin Khatun was the mother of Ala ad-Din Muhammad II, and during his reign, she held the real reins of power, though not a battlefield commander. Her influence on military decisions and her handling of the empire's disastrous conflict with the Mongols placed her at the heart of the story of war, resilience, and collapse. Her life reveals the blurred lines between political and military authority for elite women in Islamic courts, as the caliphal banners swayed across centuries, regions, and empires from the deserts of Arabia to the walls of Constantinople, from the scholars' houses of Damascus to the caravanserai of Samarkand. The stories of women who dared to lift a blade in the name of faith, survival, or honor continued to unfold, often just beyond the written records. In this half of the segment, we'll continue tracing these stories, illuminating female warriors, rebels. In this era, the boundary between warrior and court servants sometimes blurred. especially in the case of female palace guards and unit-commanded bodyguard regiments that were known to include women in rare instances, and bodyguards across the medieval Islamic world, and exploring what happened when the world decided to forget them. While their primary power was political and domestic, select Karmanas were entrusted with the Caliph's protection and were known to be trained in close combat defense arts. Some records mention women in these roles being skilled in the use of daggers and short swords. The Abbasid Caliphate and female power in the court donned armor and led a small contingent of palace guards in defense of a retreating household after a palace revolt. Though not a battlefield campaigner in the traditional sense, her name endures in rare chronicles as a woman of resolve who took up arms when the empire's internal politics turned bloody. Though the Abbasid Caliphate 750 to 1258 CE, centered in Baghdad, is remembered primarily for its intellectual golden age, its story includes unexpected traces of women trained in martial roles, particularly within the sprawling harems and royal households. One such case is a now mostly forgotten experiment attributed to a lesser emir in the 11th century, who in dagger combat and assigned the ceremonial role of protecting the emir's private library and courtyards. While no official historical confirmation of this order survives beyond scattered verses, the very existence of such poetry suggests that the idea of militarized women in Andalusia was not entirely unthinkable. According to a single poetic chronicle, attempted to create a small unit of female guards, composed of daughters of nobles and slaves. Most prominent were the Karmanas, women of authority within the harem, some of whom serve as intermediaries between the caliph and the outside world, and her decision to send her own sons to join the Arab army to ensure peace reveal a woman deeply embedded in the harsh calculus of war. She may have been a warrior outside Islam, but her story became part of Islamic memory, one that inspired later women resisting colonialism. Centuries later, here, Islamic empires such as the Seljuks and Safavids encountered or incorporated Turkic and Circassian peoples who had their own traditions of martial femininity. The Mamluks were elite warriors of Turkic, Circassian, and Balkan origin, trained from boyhood in the arts of war. Many Circassian women were taken into Islamic empires as wives or concubines, but some retained their martial traditions. In the Safavid court of Persia, noble Circassian women were prized not only for their beauty, but also, in rare cases, for their skill in riding and weaponry, and warrior priestess who led a fierce resistance against the Arab Islamic expansion. In the late 7th century, though her story sits at the frontier between history and myth, Al-Kahina is a rare and powerful example of a female military leader resisting Islamic armies, yet ironically, her legend was preserved within Islamic historiography, where she was alternately vilified and admired, but overlooked in frontier regions where survival dictated flexibility over dogma. But lesser known are the female Mamluks, a smaller and far more elusive group who were trained in similar fashion, and sometimes served as bodyguards to high-ranking women and sultanas. Across Yemen, Bedouin communities still tell tales of Bint al-Harith, a woman who reportedly held a mountain pass against a rival clan using only a bow and her courage. In rural Pakistan and Afghanistan, old women whisper about Nazoana, a Pashtun warrior poetess of the 17th century who trained her sons to fight the mules, and is remembered as both a mother and a military strategist. Their existence reveals a side of medieval Islamic society, where women's martial abilities were not entirely taboo but were cloaked in secrecy, and tied tightly to the private, internal world of the palace. As a result, most accounts of female martial activity in the Islamic world were either downplayed or recast as moral cautionary tales, examples of what happens when women stray from their designated roles. From the University of Tehran to the American University in Cairo, new generations of historians are scouring forgotten manuscripts and oral traditions for traces of female martial participation in Islamic history. Documentaries, historical novels, and even video games are beginning to reimagine what it meant to be a woman with a blade in the Muslim world. And though history tried to forget them, they have always been there, hidden behind the veil, gripping the hilt of a sword. Female warriors clash with the dominant image of the pious, modest Muslim woman, making their stories inconvenient or at best exceptional. They were not anomalies. They were women of their time, pushed into extraordinary roles by extraordinary circumstances. They were not knights by European standards, but they were warriors nonetheless, guarding lives and political secrets at the highest level. The rise of the Mamluk Sultanate and the curious case of Sid al-Mulk. Fast forward to the Mamluk Sultanate 1250 to 1517, where military slavery defined elite military ranks, and the lines between ethnicity, status, and power were continually redrawn. One tale that survives, albeit in fragmented references, concerns a noblewoman named Sid al-Mulk al-Nasiriyya Sultana who, during a crisis in Cairo, her story may be exaggerated, but it reveals the permeability of roles during times of crisis, when political instability could turn courtesans into commanders. Female martial orders, a forgotten experiment in Andalusia and Al-Andalus Islamic Spain. The intellectual and cultural richness of the society also created unusual pockets of social experimentation. The Order of the Falcon Women, if it truly existed, was trained in archery, horseback riding. This reflects the intellectual openness of the time of society where scholars, physicians, and poets flourished, and where the physical and mental training of women may have extended beyond the domestic. The Sword of Al-Kahina, North African Resistance. Turning to North Africa, we revisit a semi-legendary but historically grounded figure, Al-Kahina, the Berber queen, her leadership over a confederation of Berber tribes. Her tactical use of scorched earth to deny Arab armies supplies the female archers of the Caucasus. In the borderlands between the Islamic world and the Eurasian steppes, the roles of women in warfare expanded again. Among the Circassians, girls were often taught to ride, shoot arrows, and defend their homes from raiders. A few oral traditions from the Caucasus even recount women who participated in tribal skirmishes, while wearing men as armor, a practice deeply frowned upon in Islamic legal traditions. The fall from memory. Why were they forgotten? So why don't we learn about these women? Part of the answer lies in how Islamic historiography functioned. Court chroniclers and legal scholars wrote with particular social ideals in mind, even when these women were celebrated in poetry or folk tales. Later scholars often dismissed such stories as exaggeration, fantasy, or blasphemy, but archaeology, oral histories, and comparative anthropology increasingly challenged this narrow view. Hidden in folklore and genealogies, interestingly, the stories of these women live on not in books, but in the memories of families, tribes, and songs. These are not knightly tales in the European mold, but they serve the same function. They remind communities of the power of feminine resistance, of women who picked up weapons not for glory, but for duty, dignity, or desperation. The modern rediscovery today, scholars are returning to these stories. More importantly, Muslim women themselves, writers, researchers, and artists are reclaiming these narratives, not to romanticize war, but to challenge the narrow roles imposed by centuries of selective remembrance. Closing the segment, the sword and the silence as the candle flickers low, and the scrolls of history roll back into silence. The figures we've met: Sid al-Mulk, Al-Kahina, the Karmanas of Baghdad, and the archers of the Caucasus stand like shadows behind a veil. They were never knights in shining armor, but they were guardians, strategists, rebels, and defenders. Let us return now to the flickering shadows of castle walls, to the narrow corridors, echoing with whispers of war and diplomacy, to a time when banners fluttered over stone battlements, and nobility bore not just titles, but sometimes swords, and the low murmurs of a noble court on the brink of war. In this portion of our long and calming historical journey, we slow the pace again, to wander through the world of noble women, those born into aristocratic privilege who, against custom, and in defiance of their roles, picked up arms and rode into danger. Though they were not knights in the formal, chivalric sense, many of these women engaged directly in conflict. They defended lands, commanded troops, planned sieges, and often paid the price for standing at the intersection of birthright and battlefield. Close your eyes, if you wish, and imagine the scent of old stone, the clinking of mail, when her sons rebelled against their father in the revolt of 1173. Eleanor sided with them. Upon release, she resumed her place in politics, helping to govern England alongside her son, Richard the Lionheart, while he was away on crusade. Though the rebellion ultimately failed, her involvement demonstrated not only her political acuity, but her willingness to challenge royal authority with military means. Though she may not have stood blade to blade in battle, her presence in war councils, on crusade routes, and in civil uprisings positions her firmly among the noble women who used power in a time of swords. The year is 1341. A succession crisis has erupted following the death of Duke John III. Two rival factions emerge, one led by Charles of Blois, the other by John of Montfort, Joanna's husband. While the image of a queen on crusade might bring to mind someone quietly observing from afar, Eleanor's presence was anything but passive. Though she likely didn't fight in combat directly, her leadership among the crusading forces was real. She reportedly commanded her own retinue and exercised a measure of authority that both amazed and disturbed male contemporaries. Her efforts preserved the Montfort claim and, ultimately, helped shape the outcome of the Breton War of Succession. We begin with one of the most famous of them all. Though later sidelined politically, her legacy as a woman who stood in full armor at the head of troops endures. She wasn't a knight by order or title but by deed. Few could match her resolve. She was one of the most powerful feudal lords in the region, male or female. Born in 1122, Eleanor of Aquitaine was not just a duchess, she was one of the wealthiest and most politically powerful women of the High Middle Ages. When he was captured and imprisoned by the French crown, it seemed that the cause of his faction would collapse. She raised armies, fortified cities, and fought imperial forces in pitched battle. The chronicler Donizo, who admired her deeply, described her as a man in valor though a woman by nature. In Matilda's world, to lead was to defend, to govern was to prepare for war. And in the bloody theater of Italian politics, she stood firm. Her troops resisted repeated imperial incursions, and she personally organized the supply chains and defenses of key territories. She became Queen of France, then Queen of England, and mother to two kings. She commanded the defense of Hennebon, a vital stronghold in the conflict. There, she raised a force to invade England and depose her husband. Eyewitnesses, including chronicler Jean Froissart, describe her mounted on horseback, directing defenses, rallying soldiers, and personally participating in the defense of the city. But beyond her titles and courtly influence, she also played a provocative role in military affairs. Her rule alongside her lover and political ally Roger Mortimer lasted until Edward III came of age and took power himself. When Emperor Henry IV, excommunicated and politically desperate, was forced to stand barefoot in the snow for 3 days to seek forgiveness from Pope Gregory VII, who was sheltered there under Matilda's protection. Within weeks, Edward was captured, imprisoned, and eventually forced to abdicate in favor of their son, Edward III. Most notably, she accompanied her first husband, King Louis VII of France, on the Second Crusade. But it is undeniably one of military initiative by a woman of noble birth, who wielded influence with sword and intrigue alike, when entire populations marched eastward to claim or defend lands. The traditional boundaries between courtly life and combat sometimes dissolved. One tale recounts how, after an English battering ram damaged part of the wall, Agnes had her maids appear in full view of the attackers, dusting the damage with white cloths as if cleaning up a minor mess. Eleanor's crusading role and her broader political maneuvering earned her a fierce reputation. Her enemies called her ambitious and dangerous. Her supporters viewed her as bold and visionary. The odds were against the defenders. Yet Agnes, whose husband was away, refused to surrender. Chroniclers of the time, some respectful, others scandalized, record Eleanor donning armor and riding alongside the Knights of Aquitaine. It's important here to remember that the Crusades blurred many gender roles. Later in life, after divorcing Louis and marrying Henry Plantagenet, later King Henry II of England, she wielded even greater influence. For this rebellion, she was imprisoned for 16 years, only released after Henry's death. Eleanor's life is a tapestry of diplomacy, warfare, and survival. If Eleanor showed us how a queen could be politically militant, Joanna of Flanders, also known as the Countess of Montfort, offers us a far more literal vision of female warfare. Let's travel now to 14th century Brittany, an independent duchy in what is now Western France. John of Montfort's claim was controversial and contested, but Joanna stepped forward. With her husband in chains, she donned armor, yes, actual mail, and Platan led troops into battle. Her leadership was not symbolic. At one point, she led a surprise sortie against the enemy camp, setting fire to enemy siege engines and tents. Froissart writes, with admiration, she rode through the camp like a knight, with her sword drawn, shouting encouragement to her men. Joanna's defense of Hennebont bought critical time for reinforcements derived from England, which backed her cause. Yet this was no isolated act of passion. Joanna continued to direct military affairs for years. Matilda of Canossa, a warrior of the Holy Roman Empire. Let us now drift southward, to the Italian lands of the 11th century, where a towering figure named Matilda of Canossa rose to power. Born around 1046, Matilda inherited vast territories in northern and central Italy, including parts of Tuscany and Lombardy. Her era was defined by one of the most significant political religious conflicts of medieval Europe, the investiture controversy, which pitted the Holy Roman emperors against the popes over the right to appoint bishops. Matilda sided firmly with the papacy and didn't just support them from afar. One of her most famous moments came at the castle of Canossa in 1077. Though Matilda did not participate in combat directly, she was a strategic leader, military commander, and castle builder. Her role complicates the image of noble women as passive or cloistered. Isabella of France, she-wolf and strategist. Now let's cross the channel and time travel to early 14th century England. Isabella of France, daughter of the French king, and wife to Edward II of England, might be best remembered for her chilling nickname, the She-Wolf of France. Her story is one of political manipulation, betrayal, and a brief but critical military uprising. Unhappy in her marriage and enraged by Edward's favoritism toward his male companions, first Piers Gaveston, then Hugh Despenser, Isabella left England for France. In 1326, she landed in England with an army and quickly gained support from nobles and discontented factions. Though Isabella did not fight in battle, she led the campaign and made critical strategic decisions. Isabella's story is dark, layered, and morally complex. Agnes Randolph, defender of Dunbar Castle. Finally, let's make our way to the rugged coast of Scotland in the 14th century. There we find Agnes Randolph, also known as Black Agnes, a noblewoman whose legendary defense of Dunbar Castle against English forces became the stuff of folk songs and battlefield lore. In 1338, during the Second War of Scottish Independence, English forces under the Earl of Salisbury laid siege to Dunbar Castle. She mocked the English, ordered counterattacks, and stood proudly on the battlements as enemy siege weapons hurled stones at the walls. She was as cunning as she was brave. When the English captured her brother and threatened to kill him unless she surrendered the castle, she famously replied, "I still have a brother to spare." After months of siege and no success, the English were forced to retreat, humiliated by a woman who had outwitted and outlasted them. Agnes' story, though wrapped in legend, is supported by historical records. Her resilience and humor in the face of overwhelming pressure earn her a place in the annals of Scotland's great defenders. Let us pick up our journey where the fire of defiance still smolders, in the cold halls of stone fortresses, and where banners of noble houses ripple against the wind, not just in pride, but in warning. But by taking command at a time when England teetered on the edge of chaos, these women were not merely placeholders, they embodied the state, and their decisions held the weight of armies. During her husband Edward III's campaigns in Scotland, the Scots, emboldened, sought to strike into English territory. When they laid siege to Newcastle and Durham, it was Philippa, then only a young queen, who oversaw the defense preparations and personally rallied the garrison. Here, Petronilla of Aragon ruled as a child queen, later marrying Ramon Berengar IV, Count of Barcelona. She was recognized as queen in her own right, issuing charters and attending councils and court chronicles. Her name was not simply ornamental, but active, a sign of authority and legitimacy. Though her direct military involvement is debated, her royal marriage cemented one of the most powerful Christian coalitions during the Reconquista, a 14th century noblewoman of Northamptonshire, England. Agnes is said to have taken her ailing father's place in a mounted lance duel. Petronilla's reign reminds us that sometimes the sword a woman wields is one of legitimacy and law, commanding armies not by charging into battle, but by uniting kingdoms. The siege of Toulouse, the iron will of Philippa of Hainaut, even when framed as anecdotal. Such legends shape perceptions of female bravery in the noble classes. In the 14th century, Philippa of Hainaut, Queen Consort of England, made history not through a sword in hand. This act alone, while not a duel in armor, showcased the military leadership capabilities expected of queens and noble women in their husband's absence. With skill and force, she unhorsed him, only then revealing her identity by removing her helmet and letting down her hair. It is said she later married the astonished opponent, and the Dudley family adopted a crest of a bareheaded woman in armor in her honor. She was not just a royal consort or the mother of the Black Prince, she was also a negotiator, organizer, and political force. When conflict came to their gates, they might be forced to make impossible decisions whether to surrender, resist, or negotiate. She helped secure supplies, maintain domestic order, and influence morale. She navigated political alliances, oversaw fortifications, and managed troops all before the age of 20. The castle was their battlefield, the estate their command. These behind-the-scenes efforts remind us that the role of a female military leader was often indirect but by no means unimportant. The nuns not only organized the defense, but reportedly used crossbows to fend off attackers until reinforcements arrived. Tregine Khatun, the widow of Beghet Khan, ruled the Mongol Empire as regent from 1241 to 1246. Their prayers were backed with bolts. Young noblewomen, sometimes no older than 14 or 15, played key roles in preserving morale, tending to wounded defenders, and even managing supply lines during prolonged castle sieges. But again, these stories fuel the perception of clever, brave girls raised in the codes of knighthood. Nunneries like those of the Teutonic Order or Cistercian branches often had defensive capabilities, and in times of invasion or unrest, these religious women might take up arms. Philippa's legacy was perhaps most powerfully seen during the aftermath of the Battle of Crécy. Her rule was marked by effective administration and ambitious diplomacy, including direct contact with European courts via emissaries. Petronilla of Aragon, queen by blood, warrior by spirit back in the 12th century. The Iberian Peninsula was a crucible of Christian-Muslim conflict. Petronilla's rule was unique. Though her husband led military campaigns, he ruled not as king, but as prince consort, and Petronilla retained sovereign power. Later, she would formally abdicate the throne in favor of her son, but only after securing the political foundations of what would become the crown of Aragon. Agnes Hodet, the duel for honor. Agnes Hodet's story is shrouded in local legend, but it is one that has long delighted historians and folklorists alike. Donning his armor, she entered the field against a male challenger who had insulted their family's name. Whether embellished or true, this tale reflects the idealized vision of noble women not only capable of martial skill, but of representing family honor, often as fiercely as any son might. Khatun Tregine, empress and strategist of the Mongol Empire. While not European, the reach of aristocratic female leadership during the medieval period extended to places like the Mongol Empire. Though not a knight in the European sense, Tregine directed military campaigns, negotiated with foreign powers, and secured her son's succession to the throne. Her example serves as a bridge between cultures, proof that aristocratic women across the medieval world, not just in Europe, held powerful, even war-making, roles when systems allowed or demanded it. Ladies of the chateau, everyday defenders of the realm, there were countless noble women across France, England, and Germany whose stories are not written in golden ink, but preserved in obscure charters, dowries, or siege records. Many ran estates during wartime, overseeing the defense of castles while their husbands or brothers were on campaign. One such woman was Alix de Thouars, Duchess of Brittany, who, in the early 13th century, found herself governing a contested realm between England and France. Even within the domestic walls of the chateau, noble women trained in the use of small arms, understood siege logistics, and sometimes participated in active defense. The crossbow and the cloister, nuns with a vow of steel in medieval Germany and Eastern Europe. Some noble women entered convents that were not passive retreats, but fortified institutions. One chronicle tale tells of a convent near Vienna, besieged during a minor feudal conflict. These were noble daughters who, while devoted to God, did not abandon their understanding of tactics and defense inherited from their birthright. Daughters of siege, teenage heroines, and hidden courage, another form of quiet. Courageous military resistance came in the form of siege survival. One anonymous account from the 100 Years' War describes a noble girl, the daughter of a French baron, who devised a scheme to smuggle messages past the besieging English forces using trained pigeons, likely an embellishment. Their role may not have involved open warfare, but their strategic minds, emotional endurance, and willingness to defy fear made them indispensable players in the theater of medieval conflict. Despite their valor, many noble women warriors were gradually obscured in the male-centered chronicles of the Middle Ages. The reasons are both structural and intentional. Chroniclers were often male clerics with little interest in promoting female agency, especially in warfare. Where women were mentioned, they were often relegated to romantic or moralistic narratives, the fair lady in need of rescue, the temptress of distraction, or the exceptional heroine whose deeds only proved the rule. The sword of a noble woman might be literal, but history's memory dulled its edge. Yet, through marginalia in manuscripts, stray entries in estate ledgers, or family crests featuring armored maidens, we catch fleeting glimpses of a forgotten martial nobility. Today, historians continue to piece together these lives from fragmentary records and family legends reconstructing the legacy of aristocratic women who, for brief moments, stood on the ramparts not as brides, but as warriors. Their stories, varied and complex, reflect the breadth of what it meant to be a noble woman in a violent, hierarchical world. In this segment, we've uncovered a realm of female strength often lost to time, the noble woman who commanded respect, not only for her lineage, but for her resolve in times of conflict. From commanding sieges to dueling in secret, from administering kingdoms to defending cloisters, these women left indelible marks on the fabric of medieval military life. They remind us that behind every crest and coat of arms, behind every banner flying above the castle gate, there may have stood a woman whose courage earned her place not just in lineage, but in legend. The lake was quiet. Its waters, undisturbed, reflected the morning sky in still perfection. But at its center, something stirred a ripple, faint but deliberate, and then a shimmer of silver beneath the surface. In Arthurian myth, she is the giver of swords, the mentor of Merlin, the weaver of destinies. But behind every myth, there's often a whisper of reality. And so tonight, as we travel gently into the twilight of the medieval world, we ask, was there a real Lady of the Lake? The archetype of the sacred female guardian, the spiritual warrior, has deep roots stretching into the prehistoric and early historical worlds of Europe. Were there women who lived and moved at the borders of battle and belief, whose stories became legend? In time, from this watery realm emerged an arm, pale as moonlight, robed in silk and draped in droplets of dew. Springs and lakes were treated as portals, and offerings were cast into them, coins, weapons, and even entire chariots, suggesting that they were places of tremendous ritual importance. Is it such a leap, then, to imagine that some women were tasked with guarding these places? In Norse culture, the Valkyr or seeresses were described as powerful and feared. One such figure, Hervor, a shield maiden of saga lore, traveled to her father's burial mound to demand his enchanted sword. The sword, Turfing, was cursed, but she took it nonetheless. Fighting in her father's name and seeking vengeance, Hervor's tale, though fantastical, bears striking resemblance to the mythic archetype of the Lady of the Lake, a woman who receives and protects the sword of destiny. They wore cloaks adorned with animal fur and carried staffs that resembled spears or scepters. Yet echoes of those earlier traditions seem to resurface in the Arthurian cycle. She resides in a mystical body of water and bestows Excalibur upon Arthur, marking him as the rightful king. In others, she battles Merlin with her own spells, binding or even killing him. The lady's domain water is traditionally feminine, liminal, and associated with intuition, mystery, and rebirth. Her role as sword giver ties her to ancient traditions of sacral kingship. where the right to rule was granted not by inheritance alone, but by the favor of the divine. Feminine. In 14th century France, a woman named Jeanne de Brigue was tried for sorcery, not for any evil deed, but because she was believed to use enchanted springs and sacred relics to heal people. The fear she inspired was as much about her knowledge as her gender, but she is likely the distillation of many women, sacred guardians, battlefield seers, mystic healers, spiritual leaders. Their stories, too dangerous, too unorthodox, were often buried or reshaped by later chroniclers, but they survive in legend, cloaked in mist and magic. Far from a passive figure, the lady is a shaper of fate, a wielder of knowledge, and a keeper of the sacred. She also takes back the sword upon his death, closing the cycle of sovereignty. In one high-status grave in East Anglia, a woman was buried with a small C, a type of blade, and the staff, symbols of authority, protection, and perhaps ritual power. The fact that she was buried near a spring only deepens the symbolism. While not knights in the conventional sense, these women were considered dangerous, or were they drawing from whispered folk memories of women who once stood by lakes, in armor or in robes, safeguarding the weapons and destinies of their people? Hildegard of Bingen, though a nun, commanded great respect and even dictated political and spiritual guidance to emperors and popes. Her visions, filled with symbols and cosmic battles, echo the narrative forms of mythic tales, and sacred, capable of changing the tides of fate through their knowledge of magic and their connection to the gods. And if so, could their stories have inspired the myth of a woman rising from the water with a sword? In its hand it bore a sword, ancient and gleaming. It was Excalibur, and the arm belonged to a woman, not a queen, nor a commoner, but a being somewhere in between, a guardian of legend, a priestess of fate. It's impossible to know for certain, but they lived in a cultural space where the boundary between the sacred and the martial was porous, and where women could, under certain conditions, bear both the sword and the staff. For centuries, this image, the Lady of the Lake, has haunted the edges of Western storytelling. Let us trace their footsteps, those forgotten priestesses, sword maidens, and guardians of the sacred, and explore the thin veil that separates the real from the imagined. Sacred women of the ancient world, before the lady took the sword. Before we can understand the Lady of the Lake, we must look further back, before Arthur and Merlin, before even the Roman legions marched across Britain. Across Celtic and Germanic traditions, certain women held spiritual authority. They were called by many names: druids, vulvas, velier, sibyls, wise women. One Gallic woman, Veleda, was revered as a prophetess and intermediary with the divine. During the Batavian revolt against Rome in the 1st century CE, Veleda was said to command great authority. Her words carried the weight of strategy and the scent of divine favor. Some were healers, others seers, and some were guardians of places, springs, groves, or lakes. Sacred bodies of water were often believed to be thresholds between worlds, places where one could commune with the gods or receive divine visions. In Gaul, Roman historians like Tacitus and Caesar recorded with surprise the influence of women among them. Tribes, water was often central to these sacred roles. Sword-bearers and priestesses, women with weapons in ritual and war, while mainstream medieval warfare was dominated by men. Women in the spiritual sphere often defied this divide. Icelandic sagas and skaldic poetry describe women wielding not just influence, but also weapons. In Anglo-Saxon England, archaeological discoveries support the idea that some women were buried with weapons not common, but not unheard of either. Were these women warrior priestesses, guardians of sacred knowledge and protectors of their communities? Arthurian legend, from memory to myth, by the time the stories of King Arthur and his knights began to crystallize in the medieval imagination. Centuries had passed since the days of Veleda and Hervor. The Lady of the Lake appears in various forms and names throughout the legends: Nimue, Viviane, or simply the Lady. In some versions, she raises Lancelot after the death of his father, training him in the ways of chivalry and magic. These tales, though shaped by medieval Christian writers, retain pagan undercurrents. One might ask, did the writers of these tales invent her outright? While no historical document names a real Lady of the Lake, medieval chronicles do mention women who blurred the boundaries between mystic and martial. Even in religious life, Some medieval abbesses wielded power akin to that of feudal lords. So what do we make of the Lady of the Lake? She may not have walked the earth as a single, named individual. In the earlier centuries of medieval Europe, the woman who held spiritual power was often cloaked in suspicion, especially as the church sought to consolidate and codify its authority. But this did not mean all memory of martial women disappeared. Some of these women, particularly in hagiographic tales or religious biographies, were transformed into saints who had once taken up arms or, more often, spiritual arms. Take, for example, Saint Joan of Arc, who stands at the intersection of this legend and reality. By the time of her emergence in the 15th century, the idea of a spiritually guided woman who led men in battle was both shocking and eerily familiar. Though the church condemned her in the end, the narrative arc of her life had deep folkloric echoes. She was a peasant girl given divine visions, a sword, and the authority to lead in war. She spoke directly with saints. In many ways, Joan was a Christianized echo of older pagan traditions, a woman marked by the divine, guided by spirits, and feared for the power she claimed to wield. In Italy, bringing with them ideas of spiritual equality or, in the eyes of authorities, dangerous heresies. Some of these sects allowed women to preach, teach, and even perform healing rituals. The blade was no longer sacred, it was dangerous, unless held in male hands. Others whispered of sacred female insider revival, perhaps unknowingly, of the same archetypes as the Lady of the Lake. But there were others less famous, less tragic, and perhaps even more intriguing, as witch trials and inquisitions gained ground in the later Middle Ages. Women who showed knowledge or claimed visions were increasingly branded as witches or heretics. Where once a woman who bore a sword from a lake might be seen as divine, she was now suspected of demonic pact. A woman who waited by the shoreline for her lost warrior husband, or who knew the way to the drowned city of Ease. In some tellings, she held a sword made of water or light, and only the pure of heart could see her. Among these, the sword, the lake, and the woman are the most enduring. In parts of Ireland and Wales, Christian mystics would sometimes be associated with battle in spiritual terms. To be given a sword by a woman, especially one of otherworldly origin, was to be chosen. This narrative is deeply subversive. It grants a woman the power to confer legitimacy, to anoint, even to judge. It quietly challenges the patriarchal assumption that authority must be granted from man to man. Certain abbesses and holy women were recorded as having visions of conflict, or calling for divine justice, in the silence of medieval manuscripts, in the margins of saints' lives, and in the whispered stories told beside fires. She survives as a body of water. It represents both mystery and transition. It is reflective, concealing, deep. While the church emphasized the Virgin Mary as the ideal woman, meek, pure, and obedient, folklore clung to other ideals: wisdom, courage, wildness, and maternal strength. Her strength is tempered by sorrow, her wisdom by loneliness. This mirrors the fate of many real women in history who stepped beyond their expected roles. Though they may have wielded metaphorical swords, they often paid dearly for it. The warrior priestess, even in fragmented form, embodied these traits. She was mother and warrior, healer and seer. In many cultures, lakes were seen as portals to the spirit world or gateways to ancient knowledge. She wields flaming swords, rides dragons, and commands armies, but beneath the armor, she carries the old symbols: mystery, mercy, memory. The Lady of the Lake, then, becomes a guardian of that liminal space. She is a threshold being, offering power but demanding reverence. The Celtic Christian tradition, in particular, retained a trace of older Druidic reverence for women as spiritual vessels. Figures like Saint Bridget of Kildare, though not warriors in a literal sense, were said to have divine authority over kings and even elements of nature. Some were said to carry knives not for combat, but ritual. Others reportedly walked alone at night, visiting burial mounds and whispering over bones. While not knights in any chivalric sense, they held dominion in the realm of female parallel to the knight's battlefield. The church co-opted these tales, wrapping them in orthodoxy while leaving just enough mystery to keep their ancient power intact. Witch, warrior, or wise woman, the fine line of power. And though they weren't formally written into knighthood or courtly records, they held sway in the imagination, especially at night, when the hearth fire flickered low and the world seemed thinner. As we wade deeper into the mythic realm, it becomes clear how precarious the role of a spiritually powerful woman truly was. In medieval Europe, there were countless local legends of women who could summon storms, find lost objects, or bless crops with fertility. Some of these women were linked to nature gods of old, others were simply herbalists, midwives, or healers whose knowledge was passed through generations. Their tools were not swords, but poultices, not shields, but prayers, yet they held power, and power always threatened. The church was often at odds with these women, especially as theological movements like the Cathars or Wallensians spread through France. Unfortunately, this perceived spiritual independence often came at a terrible cost. Even the idea of a warrior priestess became conflated with rebellion, chaos, or evil in ecclesiastical texts. The forest keepers and border mystics, though mainstream medieval culture suppressed these stories. Folklore preserved them, particularly in border regions, mountain villages, and deep forests. In the Carpathians, tales persisted of Volvids as wise women who could command animals, foresee battles, and serve as protectors of the forest. In Brittany, too, the figure of the wise woman by the sea remained. Sometimes she was a healer, other times a ghost. These stories echoed older beliefs, adapted to the Christian landscape but never quite erased. Symbols carried forward: sword, water, and the divine feminine. There are symbols that persist across centuries, even when their meanings evolve. The sword was never just a weapon. In medieval lore, it was often a symbol of justice, divine will, or kingly right. The lake, too, holds significance. And finally, the divine feminine, a theme suppressed yet persistent in medieval Christianity, the quiet resurrection of myth in modern fantasy. Though the real Lady of the Lake was likely never a single historical figure, her spirit lives on. And now, she thrives in modern retellings. From novels to television, from Arthurian reimaginings to fantasy epics, the warrior woman of myth is having a quiet renaissance. Interestingly, many modern adaptations present her as both powerful and tragic. Still, the archetype endures, not as a footnote, not as a fantasy, but as a reflection, distant, shimmering, and very real of the women who dared to stand at the lake's edge and reach for the sword. The siege was one of the most terrifying experiences in medieval life, long, brutal, and often decisive. While male commanders and knights dominated war narratives, there were pivotal moments when the defense of entire strongholds fell upon the shoulders of noble women. To have a castle your home, your sanctuary surrounded by an enemy that sought not only to break your walls, but also your will, was no small ordeal. Food supplies dwindled, disease spread, fear grew. In this 8,000-plus word segment, we'll explore real historical examples of women who commanded castles, made strategic decisions under siege, and sometimes outwitted their attackers not with brute force, but with sheer resolve, diplomacy, cunning, and nerve. These weren't mythical warrior queens, but real noble women who stepped into the chaos of war not because they wanted to, but because they had to. It is difficult to grasp, from the quiet of our beds in the modern world, just how loud, stressful, and psychologically grueling a medieval siege could be. Yet, in these darkest moments, history gives us glimpses of extraordinary women who rose not only to survive but to lead. And unlike the pages of chivalric romance, there were no flowery speeches, no sweeping armor-clad charges. According to contemporary chronicles, King John himself wrote to her during the crisis, calling her our beloved and faithful servant. She remained in control of the castle for several more years, and affirming her as Sheriff of Lincolnshire, making her incredibly the only woman in medieval England officially appointed to that post. These women defended with grit, guile, and grim determination. Let's begin with one of the most famous examples, Nicola de la Haye, a woman who stood against the king. Nicola de la Haye, sheriff, strategist, survivor, but when enemies threatened the kingdom during her regency in the 1220s and 1230s, Blanche transformed from maternal protector into a master of military logistics. This was rare but not unheard of. Noble families, sometimes past administrative, or military roles to daughters. If no male heir was present, though no direct hand-to-hand combat is recorded, the chroniclers note that her leadership demoralized the attackers, who underestimated her entirely. Their armies converged on Paris, and the city faced the real possibility of siege. But what Nicolas did with the role was truly unique. In the late 12th and early 13th centuries, Nicolas de la Haye was not simply the Lady of Lincoln Castle, she was its lifeline. The city itself had fallen to rebels allied with Prince Louis of France. Her castles dotting the Apennines were more than homes, they were staging grounds, military hubs, and defensive barriers during the investiture controversy, a power struggle between the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor. When the emperor came to reconcile with the Pope, it was Matilda's strategic hold over the region that forced him to kneel in the snow for 3 days. Her castles became symbols of spiritual and political defiance, and she, their guardian. Only the castle remained loyal to the king, held by Nicolas and a small garrison. Born into the noble de la Haye family, she inherited the position of Castellan castle governor from her father. In 1216, during the First Barons' War, civil war between King John of England and rebel barons, Lincoln Castle became a critical stronghold. For 6 long months, Nicolas endured siege conditions, blocked supplies, repeated attacks, and internal pressure to surrender. She didn't, but also led a surprise sortie, riding out on horseback in full armor to set fire to enemy siege equipment. Chronicles call her the Woman Knight, though the term was likely more descriptive than official. When her husband was captured and imprisoned in France, Jean took up his cause and his fortress. Eventually, she held the castle until English reinforcements arrived. Her resistance bought her son time and the throne. At this point, Nicolas was already around 60 years old, an age at which most noble women had long retired from public life. Yet she remained defiant. Eventually, reinforcements arrived, and the siege was broken. But Nicolas had done what few thought possible. She had held the line. Their status gave them access to castles, retainers, and some autonomy. Common women, while sometimes involved in desperate defense, rarely had the authority to lead. Her story shows us that when duty called, women could not only match, but exceed the leadership expected of knights. In these quiet, often overlooked moments, women shaped the fate of cities and kingdoms. Blanche of Castile, the mind behind the crown, our next tale moves from the fortress to the throne, though Blanche of Castile was no armchair ruler. Blanche was the Queen of France, wife of King Louis VIII, and later regent for her son, Louis IX. St. Louis, during his minority, in one particularly tense moment, a coalition of French nobles rebelled. What did Blanche do? She oversaw the fortification of the capital, organized defense networks, and even inspected the walls herself, leading from the front. In another campaign, when her son's forces were engaged far from home, Blanche raised and financed entire armies, negotiated truces, and coordinated troop movements. While she may not have wielded a sword, Blanche showed that castles were not only defended with walls, they were protected with strategy, patience, and unshakable authority. Matilda of Tuscany, the Iron Countess, jumping across the centuries and the Alps. We meet another iron-willed figure, Matilda of Tuscany, who lived in the 11th century. Known as La Grande Comtesse, Matilda was one of the most powerful and militarily active women in medieval Europe. Matilda not only financed and supplied resistance to Emperor Henry IV, she commanded troops, held key mountain passes, and led the defense of her fortresses in person. One famous event was the defense of Canossa, a fortress where Pope Gregory VII had taken refuge. Though not a knight in name, Matilda embodied the martial spirit, commanding respect from popes and emperors alike. Defending without weapons, psychological and diplomatic siegecraft, it is important to remember that defending a castle wasn't always a matter of swinging swords and raining arrows. Sometimes it was about outlasting, outwitting, or even out-talking the besiegers. Take the case of Jeanne de Montfort, Duchess of Brittany, during the War of the Breton Succession in the 14th century. At the Siege of Hennebon in 1342, Jeanne not only oversaw the defense, Jeanne's actions demoralized the attackers and rallied her garrison. Common threads: agency, opportunity, and social constraints, these examples are exceptional, but they are not fantasy. Each woman faced different conditions. Some were regents, others widows or heiresses. Some were militarily trained, most were not. But they all had one thing in common. They were the last line of defense when no one else remained. And they chose to stand firm. But we must also remember that these were elite women. Even so, history shows us that medieval warfare wasn't purely male. Let us return to the crackling tension of besieged ramparts, where shadows danced across cold stone and the scent of oil and blood filled the air. In the last part, we explored the societal context, expectations, and real-life examples of noble women, stepping into command when their husbands or male guardians were away defending their homes, not just through diplomacy or prayer, but with grit and tactical resilience. Now we move even deeper into the heart of the sieges themselves, uncovering the intricate details of their command strategies, emotional burdens, and how these women shaped the outcome of medieval warfare from behind the walls. They were never expected to control. While the most famous defense came from Jean de Dunois arriving with reinforcements, it's believed that the Lady of the Castle and de Beaujeu helped organize early resistance, including strategic defense of the bridge and coordination of supplies. Her precise contribution remains underreported, but hints from letters and court records suggest she played a greater role than publicly acknowledged. But by inner doubts, by soldiers who might question your orders, and by servants whispering tales of doom, maintaining morale was often the hidden battlefield. Whether she felt fear or not, she knew it could not show, ensuring that bread was shared fairly, that children were calmed, that sick rooms didn't become breeding grounds of despair. All these fell under the unseen duties of women in command. You were simultaneously the hope and the fear of the household. The siege is a theater of power. In a letter dated April 1459, she describes organizing defense of Caister Castle, rallying household staff, and communicating with her husband John Paston about the logistics of resistance. That reputation didn't come by accident. It was carefully cultivated to keep swords raised and spirits from falling. In medieval warfare, the siege was not only a military tactic, it was also a test of psychological and physical endurance. Their status as women, especially noble women, often provided a measure of protection in parley. But this, too, was fraught with risk. A misstep could lead to imprisonment, disgrace, or even execution. A noble woman had to know when to bluff, when to concede, and how to protect her people without appearing weak. Letters, household account books, and legal documents sometimes reveal moments of decision-making that hint at leadership roles. After his death at Evesham, Eleanor negotiated the surrender of the castle. Accused of overstepping, they were publicly humiliated, sometimes forcibly veiled, and confined to religious institutions as symbolic punishment for their ambition. Her ability to delay and control the terms of surrender arguably saved the lives of many within. Her case set a precedent. Women who wielded power in wartime could expect not praise but suspicion. For the women left in charge of castles, leading during a siege meant balancing the defense of property, the morale of those within, and the expectations of gendered behavior. Being a woman did not always spare them from the consequences of resistance. In fact, it could make the betrayal more unforgivable. While individual names were rarely recorded, their collective presence was vital to the defense. There are tales in which noble women oversaw rations, organized night watches, negotiated with enemy envoys. They were not commanders in the traditional sense, but they were leaders of another kind, and made impossible decisions, sometimes ordering the death of traitors or the reinforcement of walls that meant forcing serfs to work to exhaustion. The structure of a castle provided physical protection, but maintaining order within those walls, especially during starvation, fear, and betrayal, required deft hands and steel nerves, and the burden of silence. A noble woman who led a defense might be advised to keep quiet, resume her place in the parlor, and let her deeds be forgotten in favor of peace and political stability. Their names might appear once in a legal document, a letter, or a dismissive chronicle, only to vanish again. Why? And yet, so few are remembered. The women who defended castles were not anomalies, they were guardians of their homes. Warriors in veils, commanders of silence and resolve. A female commander in such a setting had to rely heavily on trusted advisors, but she also had to demonstrate authority to retain control. Women were heavily involved in the defense, not just as supportive figures, but through organized guilds. Her household accounts show transactions with armorers. In local militia, rare trace of female logistical command in the midst of civil unrest. For example, during the siege of Montargis in 1427, the castle was under threat from English forces. Psychological warfare, courage under isolation. Imagine being a woman in such a castle surrounded not only by armed foes beyond the walls, but as the master of her fate even if history forgot to write her name. One of the most critical aspects of a female-led defense was psychological warfare, not just against the attackers, but internally among those within. We hear in Chronicle whispers about Isabel of Conches, a 12th century noblewoman in Normandy, who not only defended her lands during a familial feud, but held the loyalty of her retainers. By projecting unwavering confidence, the chronicler Orderic Vitalis famously described her as joyful, generous, daring, and well-loved by the knights of the castle. Letters, orders, and household records reconstructing the forgotten, because women's direct participation in battle was often suppressed or dismissed by chroniclers. We rely on indirect sources to uncover their agency. Take the accounts of Margaret Paston, whose letters during the Wars of the Roses offer some of the most detailed insight into a woman defending her home. She wasn't wielding a sword on the battlements, but she was issuing orders about provisions, security, and even mustering forces. Women as negotiators, the subtler side of defense. While direct combat was rare, many noble women served as negotiators during sieges, taking up the role of envoys between besiegers and defenders. In 1264, during the Second Barons' War in England, Eleanor de Montfort attempted to hold Dover Castle while her husband, Simon de Montfort, led rebel forces. Such negotiations were not simply polite exchanges, they were strategic acts of leadership, requiring cool heads, emotional intelligence, and an acute understanding of politics, resistance, and retribution. But heroism did not guarantee mercy. In many cases, when castles fell, female defenders faced harsh punishment. In the Burgundian conflicts of the late 15th century, women who defended rebel-held castles were sometimes paraded as traitors or heretics. This practice underscored a common medieval fear, that female autonomy in war was not just unnatural, it was dangerous. Even Joan of Arc, though not defending a castle per se, was punished not only for military action, but for embodying defiant femininity. The Siege of Toulouse and the role of women's guilds. One of the lesser-known episodes of female-led resistance took place in Toulouse during the Albigensian Crusade early 13th century. Guild records show women making weapons, repairing armor, and manning walls in dire circumstances. This suggests that in urban contexts, women had more visibility and collective strength, perhaps because the civic model of medieval towns allowed for broader participation in public defense. Post-siege realities, survival, and silence. Once the siege was over, whether through victory or defeat, female commanders had to reckon with the aftermath. Property damage, death tolls, political fallout, victorious or not. Many women faded from the historical record after their acts of leadership, because survival often meant returning to roles of compliance. This is perhaps the greatest tragedy of all, that the courage shown by these women was not commemorated but carefully concealed. A legacy in shadows. So many women stood on those high stone walls gazing out at the enemy, calculating risk, issuing orders with trembling hands or steady gazes. Their legacies lie not in statues or epic poems, but in half-burned records, overlooked letters, in the architecture of castles that may once have echoed with their voices. As we close this segment, the image lingers, a woman in a heavy gown, walking the battlements by torchlight, not as a damsel in distress. It is a quiet night now, perhaps you've settled into a soft bed. The faint rustle of linen around your shoulders, the world outside slowly falling silent. Let your thoughts drift back into the past. Not the grand, celebrated past of kings, while some were celebrated, even knighted. Most paid a steep price for stepping beyond the narrow expectations imposed upon them, and crusaders but into the margins, the shadows. the overlooked corners of history where defiance could be as simple as picking up a sword. Tonight, we will explore the deeply uncomfortable and often dangerous consequences for women who dared to defy the strict boundaries of their gender. Roles in the medieval world. It defined a man's status, a noble family's reputation, and critically a woman's place in society. The ideal woman was silent, obedient, chaste, and cloistered. She might be educated if noble, pious if devout, and married off as soon as her body allowed. Let's begin, gently now, with a breath and a story. 1. The boundaries of the acceptable in the medieval world. Honor was a fragile currency. It wasn't just that they were doing something unusual. It was that they were performing masculinity. And in doing so, were seen to disrupt the very foundations of medieval social order. But what of the women who refused that script? A woman was meant to nurture, obey, and bear children. What of the women who wanted to ride out, swords strapped to their side, defending a castle or following a call to battle? It was a violation of cosmic order, a blasphemous inversion of the natural hierarchy. The penalty for being caught wasn't merely scandalous. It could be lethal. For most of these women, the act of simply being seen in armor was enough to provoke scandal. It was that doing so publicly invited suspicion, gossip, fear, and swift judgment. The consequences could be social ruin, excommunication, in some cases, public execution. This wasn't just about war, it was about the body, and everything it symbolized. 2. Gender as performance in the Middle Ages. But in the medieval worldview, gender was far more rigidly binary and bound not by biology alone, but by divinely ordained roles. Her refusal to wear women's clothing in prison, despite torture, was used as evidence in her trial for heresy. She was not just burned for claiming divine vision, she was burned for defying gender norms. Before diving into specific stories, we must pause to understand how medieval society viewed gender. To us, gender may be understood today as both identity and expression. A man was meant to protect, to lead, to fight, though she led a crusade and governed vast territories. Her name was often dragged through the mud, accused of sexual promiscuity and manipulation. If a woman did something perceived as male, say, wearing trousers, training with weapons, or shouting orders at men, it wasn't just a personal rebellion. This is why so many female warriors had to operate in secrecy. A woman doing the same was sinful, even scandalous. She raised armies, negotiated political alliances, and fought for her right to rule. Gossip and rumors could ruin a woman's chance of social restoration. Her male rivals, however, described her as haughty, unwomanly, and proud beyond measure. Those caught violating these laws could face imprisonment or public humiliation. A woman who fought was seen as unnatural or impossible, witch or a vessel for demons. Confession, penance, and public repentance were often demanded. Those who resisted could be excommunicated. In the worst cases, charges of heresy or witchcraft could follow. In some laws, wearing men's clothing was equated with witchcraft or heresy. It wasn't that women were legally forbidden to wield swords in all places. 3. The dangers of female visibility. In cases where women did fight or command troops, they often did so under exceptional circumstances: the death of a husband, the absence of male heirs, or the immediate defense of a household. These women might be tolerated for a while, but the moment their visibility grew, or their success threatened established power, they became vulnerable to character assassination. Consider Joan of Arc. Her armor, her leadership, and her military victories made her a national icon, but also an iconoclast. The symbolism mattered. Armor was not neutral. On a woman's body, it became a scandalous statement of reversal, and medieval society had a limited tolerance for such statements. For scandal in the chronicles, vilification, and smearing. Many noble women who dared to lead armies, hold castles, or speak too freely were subjected to the chronicler's pens, and rarely in flattering terms. Take the case of Empress Matilda, claimant to the English throne during the 12th century. Chroniclers relished in her failures and often described her in moralistic terms, accusing her of arrogance and painting her ambition as unnatural. The same was true for Eleanor of Aquitaine. It wasn't just their deeds that sparked criticism. It was the fact that they dared to act like men. A male noble plotting for power was political. 5. Punishment, social, legal, and spiritual punishment for women who stepped outside gender norms took many forms. Social punishment. Noble families often disowned daughters who shamed them. Marriages could be annulled, children taken away. Legal punishment. In some kingdoms, laws explicitly forbade women from donning armor or serving in combat. Spiritual punishment. The church played a pivotal role. Women were seen as spiritual temptresses or moral weak points. And for common women peasants or lower-class fighters, justice was often more brutal and swift. There was no noble title to cushion their fall. 6. The danger of the cross-dressing accusation. Wearing men's clothing was often a necessity for women who wished to fight, but it was also one of the most dangerous acts a woman could commit in the eyes of the church. Theologians saw cross-dressing not just as sinful, but as an inversion of divine law. Citing Deuteronomy 20:5, a woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man wear women's clothing, for the Lord detests anyone who does this. This biblical passage was used in trials to convict women. Who wore armor? Joan of Arc, again, was the most famous case. But there were others. Cross-dressing was lumped in with sodomy and heresy, making it a crime of moral corruption. In many towns, even rumors of women dressing as men could prompt trials, accusations, or mass hysteria. 7. Warrior saints and dangerous exceptions. Interestingly, the only women allowed to break gender norms without punishment were often canonized saints. St. Catherine of Alexandria, St. Margaret of Antioch, and St. Joan of Arc posthumously were all reimagined as holy warriors after death. The key difference: their fighting was cast as symbolic a metaphor for spiritual struggle, not real warfare. In medieval art, these saints were often depicted in armor, slaying dragons or wielding swords, but they were also virgins, untouched by worldly power. In other words, their gender transgressions were forgiven if they died, remained pure, or if their stories were safely removed from real politics. Real women with power, on the other hand, were rarely given such grace. 8. The double standard of chivalry. Chivalry, the knightly code, was steeped in ideas of honor, loyalty, and service. A woman who did the same was often seen as shameful. But chivalry had little room for women wielding swords. A man who fought for his homeland was a hero, even in cases where a woman's defense of her castle saved hundreds of lives. She might be praised privately but dismissed publicly. Why? Because her success complicated the myth of male superiority. It exposed the lie that only men could be brave or clever or strong. To preserve the ideal of chivalry, female fighters had to be erased or rewritten as exceptions, not rules. 9. The weaponization of sexuality. A particularly cruel method of shaming warrior women was to associate their actions with sexual deviance. Powerful women were frequently accused of promiscuity, adultery, or lesbianism. These accusations were rarely based on truth. They were tools used to discredit and humiliate. Even noble women might be confined to comments as punishment. A woman leading troops: she must be sleeping with them. A woman dressing as a man: she must be trying to seduce women. These insinuations were toxic and dangerous. In some regions, women accused of sexual transgressions could be stoned, whipped, or drowned. That the hierarchy wasn't divine, but designed in 10. Why the scandal mattered so much, you might wonder. Why was this such a big deal? Why did the idea of a woman in armor frighten society so deeply? Because it threatened control. It suggested that the rules weren't natural, but constructed. And if a woman could be a knight, what else could she be? A ruler, a priest, a scholar, a citizen? Scandal wasn't just about the act. It was about the possibility the act revealed. To keep power in place, that possibility had to be buried. The image of the male knight, bold, honorable, and masculine, dominated medieval memory, in no small part due to how carefully it was curated. Much of what we know about chivalry, warfare, and knighthood was shaped by the chroniclers and scribes of the time, nearly all of whom were men. Often clerics, monks, or court-appointed historians with a very specific ideological lens. This part of the story explores how women's roles in warfare, nobility, and defense were not only underrepresented but systematically erased, revised, or dismissed in historical narratives. Whether in the parchment chronicles of English monasteries, the chants and digest of French courts, or the illustrated codices of the Holy Roman Empire in Western Europe, a majority of written records came from monastic communities. These institutions were highly patriarchal, deeply religious, and rooted in theological understandings that reinforced specific social hierarchies. The absence of female knights in many sources says more about intentional exclusion than historical non-existence. Women left in the margins, the monastic view of history. Female combatants were sometimes documented, but usually with the subtle or overt implication that they were rare aberrations. A chronicler might record that Lady So-and-so held the tower for 3 weeks, but would often follow it with a statement to the effect of, "Such courage is rare among women." The woman became a footnote, not a model. "She fought like a man" was a common phrase, suggesting that masculinity was the default and only valid mode of warfare. Many records that mention women in armor framed them not as heroes or leaders, but as anomalies, sinners, or divinely punished figures. A woman taking up the sword might be tolerated in fiction or religious allegory, as a metaphor for chastity or divine wrath, but in real-life accounts, she was often a point of discomfort. The absence of evidence was misread as evidence of absence. Female knights exist in fringe literatures such as Britomart and the Fairy Queen centuries later, but they are not part of the central medieval literary canon. Instead, chivalric ideals were deeply gendered, revolving around the male knight serving his lady, not the lady wielding her own sword. Over generations, family genealogies and noble registers omitted female achievements. Legal documents did not record a woman's martial deeds in the same way they did a man's, reinforcing the myth that such deeds never occurred at all. Medieval history was not written in a vacuum. It was penned by individuals with spiritual, cultural, and political agendas. A woman might have commanded men in a siege, defended her homeland, and led a household into battle only to be remembered in documents simply as the wife of a knight, with no mention of her valor, was still framed through the lens of mysticism and divine intervention, rather than as a tactical leader or knight in the secular sense. Chroniclers were more comfortable crediting Joan's visions than her battlefield strategies. Later generations of historians, particularly during the 17th to 19th centuries, inherited these silences and amplified them. When they encountered medieval women in armor, they often dismissed them as legends, misinterpreted them as men in disguise, or simply ignored the sources altogether. They read history through their own cultural lens and reinforced centuries of bias. They were not portrayed as historical actors, but as personifications in morality tales. And when they were found, they were often second-hand or steeped in male interpretation. Think of the works of Walter Scott, Alfred Lord Tennyson, and the pre-Raphaelite painters. Their imagery of knights was overwhelmingly male. Women were muses, witches, or maidens, not warriors. When a woman performed military service, whether in defense of a castle, battlefield leadership, or espionage, there was often no formal record-keeping system to acknowledge or reward her contributions. This further pushed the real experiences of actual medieval women out of the popular imagination. Their stories were oral, passed down through family or community tradition. Unlike male military leaders who might commission their own biographies or maintain letters and journals, women warriors left few written records of their own, a missing thread in the fabric of history. And taken together, they form a tapestry of absence, a ghost of what might have been a much richer story. To these chroniclers, women warriors were often seen as unnatural, spiritually suspect, or unworthy of emulation. This may explain why even Joan of Arc, despite being one of the most documented women in medieval military history, noteworthy because she was unusual. One of the most damaging patterns in medieval and post-medieval historical writing was the treatment of women warriors as exceptions rather than examples. This was also true for noble women who led defenses during sieges. As the centuries passed, this framing compounded. Later historians looking back at medieval sources saw only the anomalies, not the patterns. The silence of vernacular literature, but each new discovery adds to the mosaic. A sword buried with a woman. They inherit a skewed legacy, a a tower defended under her command, a law passed to honor her defiance. One might hope that vernacular literature, romances, folk tales, legends would preserve the memory of warrior women more faithfully. But even here, things were complicated. It teaches us to question the official story, to seek voices that were silenced, and to reimagine the medieval world not just as a man's playground of war, but a far more complex battlefield of gender, power, and memory. In Arthurian romance, for example, powerful women like Morgan Le Fay or the Lady of the Lake are magical rather than martial. In many cases, the few female warrior archetypes that did exist were allegorical, representing virtues like justice, fortitude, or chastity. Legal and bureaucratic erasure beyond narrative suppression. There was institutional forgetting. Military service in many medieval societies came with legal entitlements, land grants, pensions, titles, and noble recognition. These were typically reserved for men. This lack of official recognition had long-term consequences. Some cases are truly tragic. The problem with later historians, the historical erasure of female knights, wasn't just a medieval problem. In the 19th century, Romanticism reignited interest in the Middle Ages, but in a highly idealized and masculine way. Victorian scholars in particular had rigid ideas of gender roles, gender literacy, and the power of storytelling. One deeper reason behind this erasure was the gendered nature of literacy and storytelling itself. Most medieval women, even noble ones, were not trained in reading Latin or writing chronicles. This meant that even when their stories were remembered, they existed in the peripheries, in songs, in letters written by men about them, or in family lore that rarely made it into the official archives. It also meant that centuries later, when historians combed through libraries and state records, the voices of women were far harder to find. Small details, big silences. The more one studies medieval sources, the clearer the silences become. In royal court roles, we might find records of a widow inheriting land after her husband's death in battle, but no mention that she had defended that land herself. In financial records, we might see an expense for armor fitted for a noblewoman, but no name, no account of her deeds, and no further elaboration. In siege narratives, the chronicler might note that the lady of the castle took command after the lord was slain, but her name is omitted, her tactics unrecorded, and her legacy forgotten. Each of these is a lost opportunity, reconstructing the forgotten. Modern historians, especially women and scholars of feminist history, are now doing the hard work of reconstruction. This means reading between the lines of male-dominated texts, comparing records across different countries and languages, reevaluating artifacts like armor, tapestries, and grave goods with a gender-sensitive lens, reclaiming oral histories and regional legends that preserve forgotten truths. Even today, many female knights remain unnamed, unrecorded, or buried beneath layers of cultural sediment. Every piece matters. Why does it matter that female knights were erased from the historical record? Because history shapes identity. When young girls learn about the past and see only men with swords and titles, they are robbed of a lineage that was always theirs. Understanding how this erasure happens systematically, methodically, and for centuries allows us to challenge it. When we imagine the Middle Ages, it is easy to conjure up the image of steel-clad knights, charging across misty fields, banners snapping in the wind while citadels loom in the distance, as mute spectators to the bloodshed beyond their walls. But these stone fortresses were not passive backdrops. They were vibrant centers of life, power, and defense. And within those fortified walls, it was often the noble women who held the keys, quite literally, to the kingdom's survival. This segment explores an oft-overlooked dimension of medieval warfare, the role of noble women in castle defense. These were not helpless damsels peeking nervously from the safety of their towers when their husbands or male relatives rode off to war or perished in battle. It was frequently the women who took command. Born in 1046, she ruled vast territories in northern Italy and was a staunch supporter of Pope Gregory VII. During the investiture controversy, Matilda not only maintained her lands during years of near-constant conflict, but managed to pass her legacy intact to the next generation. Chronicles describe her riding into battle, convening war councils, and even leading troops on horseback. Though her example was exceptional, it set a precedent for how a determined woman could wield both sword and strategy. While technically not a castle commander in the narrow sense, Matilda led armies, fortified her strongholds, and resisted repeated sieges and invasions from the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. Noble women, often married young and expected to manage estates during their husbands' absences, were not strangers to administration or logistics. Many had already been acting as de facto rulers of their households and sometimes entire fiefdoms, long before the need for military leadership arose. In 1216, with her husband and male allies either dead or absent, she commanded the castle's defense during a protracted siege. Despite being in her 60s, she led the garrison through starvation, attacks, and political intrigue. Her steadfast defense was instrumental in keeping Lincolnshire under royal control. The transition from managing kitchens and correspondence to organizing archers and ordering boiling oil was surprisingly fluid, though not without risk or resistance from a male-dominated feudal structure, but explicitly reaffirmed her command and lands an official charge, something nearly unheard of for a woman at the time. After the siege, she was appointed Sheriff of Lincolnshire, making her one of the few female sheriffs in medieval England. Built by Richard the Lionheart, the castle was a masterpiece of military architecture. But for noble women in charge, the real burden was not just in facing an enemy, but in the sheer management of a long-term siege. These negotiations could determine whether defenders lived, died, or were enslaved. Some noble women, like Margaret of Beverley, were praised for using diplomacy to save entire communities. Many were mothers, grieving the loss of husbands or sons on distant battlefields, while simultaneously bearing the responsibility of safeguarding dozens or even hundreds of lives. Yet noble women often stood their ground with a strength that belied their societal limitations. They were the quiet cornerstones of medieval survival. This meant, though its fall is most often remembered for the French army's tenacity, less discussed is the role women played within its walls. Castles required constant supervision. Food storage had to be monitored, servants coordinated, repairs commissioned, and military readiness maintained. Born into a noble family in Lincolnshire, Nicola inherited the position of Constable of Lincoln Castle, a role rarely granted to a woman. Women, including noble women, were recorded hauling stones, aiding in the movement of boiling pitch, and helping to organize the storage and distribution of food. Women helped manage cleanliness, isolation of the sick, and the burial of the dead. Noble women often served as spiritual and emotional anchors, encouraging both garrison and civilian occupants to endure. While not leading troops outright, they played a crucial role in prolonging the resistance. These actions reflect the often ignored labor and bravery of women in siege warfare, not always as generals, but as logistical pillars without whom defense would quickly collapse. From provisioning, supplies, and organizing defenses to negotiating terms with besiegers and personally directing resistance, these women stepped into the breach not just figuratively, but literally. The castle is a symbol of power in a woman's domain. In medieval society, the castle was more than a military stronghold. It was the physical embodiment of a family's wealth, authority, and responsibility. Thus, when the specter of war or siege loomed, these women did not find themselves entirely unprepared. Matilda of Tuscany, a beacon of female fortitude, one of the earliest and most famous examples of a noblewoman defending her lands with military acumen, was Matilda of Tuscany, also known as Matilda of Canossa. Her fortresses, especially the castle of Canossa, became iconic symbols of resistance. The siege of Chateau Gaillard and women in resistance fast forward to 1203 to 1204, during the Anglo-French Wars, and we find another significant event, the siege of Chateau Gaillard. Contemporary accounts describe how, as supplies dwindled and hopes of relief faded, the castle's occupants, many of them non-combatants, joined in its defense. Lady Nicola de la Haye, Sheriff, Defender, Commander. No discussion of female-led castle defense is complete without Nicola de la Haye, a truly remarkable figure in medieval English history. During the First Barons' War 1-15-1-17, Nicola proved herself to be a stalwart loyalist to King John and his young son, Henry III. What makes Nicola especially notable is that King John not only relied on her story, while unique, offers crucial insight into how women in the right circumstances could rise to command. Not just castles, but regional governance. Defensive duties, not just heroics, but daily grit. Romanticized portrayals of castle defense often center on moments of high drama walls breach. Fires lit, trumpets blaring, rationing food and water, knowing how long the siege might last. Noble women had to calculate how far stores could stretch, institute rations, and prevent hoarding. Preventing disease, castles under siege were vulnerable to outbreaks of illness, especially as sanitation degraded. Maintaining morale, the psychological strain of a siege could be immense. Negotiating terms, in many cases, it was the lady of the castle who negotiated with besiegers. A multi-tiered role, managers, mothers, defenders. One cannot overstate the emotional and physical toll such leadership exacted on women. Castle defense was never a clean or dignified affair. Corpses piled up, wells ran dry, hope faded slowly. As we move deeper into the world of medieval castle defense, the role of noble women becomes increasingly nuanced. Castles were not merely structures of stone and mortar. They were microcosms of medieval life, complete with intricate hierarchies, religious duties, resource management systems, and defense protocols. These moments demanded not only courage but tactical awareness, social intelligence, and an iron will. And when men were away off to war, crusades, or political councils, it was the lady of the castle who often bore the brunt of maintaining and protecting this delicate balance. In times of siege, the weight on a noble woman's shoulders could be crushing. The art of fortification and female ingenuity, a dry well or a poisoned stream, could end resistance in days. Many noble women were responsible for rationing supplies, monitoring the state of the food stores, and ensuring that water sources remained clean and uncontaminated. Herbal knowledge, such as purifying water with crushed garlic or mint, or storing grains in sealed barrels to prevent rot and vermin, became invaluable. These were not just domestic skills, they were survival tactics. Accounts, though biased and fragmented, speak of women firing crossbows and throwing stones from battlements. Whether they did so out of desperation or ideology, they did so knowingly, standing shoulder to shoulder with their male counterparts. The lady of the castle was often trained, if not formally, then practically, in the anatomy of defense. Though likely embellished, these stories suggest a woman who did not merely endure a siege but weaponized wit, fear, and pride to outmaneuver her enemies. When her husband Patrick was away, the English Earl of Salisbury laid siege to Dunbar Castle. Agnes did not flinch. According to chroniclers, she hurled defiance from the walls with sarcasm and stone. Storage rooms became triage wards. The private chambers of the lady became war rooms where plans were drawn in candlelight. The power to instill hope, to preserve a sense of order, and to maintain psychological resistance in the face of death was no small thing. Noble women would lead prayers, sing hymns, share uplifting legends of saints and warriors, and even organize symbolic acts of resistance to project unity among defenders. She would have understood the key features of her stronghold: the portcullis, murder holes, arrow slits, curtain walls, keeps, and cistern systems. One anonymous nun wrote of her time behind castle walls during a siege in many chronicles. This aspect of women as contributions is lost, overshadowed by the clanging swords and flaming arrows, but it is no less vital to the narrative of medieval resistance. Each morning I woke wondering which of us would be dead by nightfall, and yet I smiled for the sake of the girls and boys who looked to me for peace. It was an act of theatrical defiance that mocked the enemy and elevated morale among the defenders. Noble women in besieged castles lived under constant fear of starvation, of surrender, of rape, of massacre. In oral traditions across England, France, and parts of Germany, tales persisted of ladies who never wept, of women whose cries made stone tremble, and of keepers of the hearth who made even fire obey them. The weight of watching over children, servants, and soldiers alike, knowing that failure meant ruin, was not borne lightly. In British folklore, Castles with histories of female resistance were often said to be haunted by the Lady in Grey, or the Silent Watcher. The truth, as ever, lay between the lines. These women were not ghosts, but flesh and blood figures who wrote the expectations of gendered power in times of extraordinary crisis. Ghostly figures believed to still protect their strongholds, while the tales of male knights on open fields dominate textbooks and legends. The women who guarded, governed, and at times bled for their castles deserve equal reverence. In some regions, locals would leave small offerings of food or flowers near old keeps, believing that the spirit of the lady still watched over the grounds. It was a spirit of courage, loyalty, and honor, and behind the walls of castles across medieval Europe, noble women proved that they, too, were knights in all but name. But understanding architecture was only one facet of her responsibility. When a siege began, water became the first concern. In the infamous siege of Rochester Castle in 1215, Lady Matilda de Lacy was credited with organizing rationing efforts that prolonged the resistance of the garrison for weeks. They wielded keys like scepters and managed troops with no less authority than any titled general. Their shields were stone walls, their swords were words and strategy, and in many cases, they triumphed, though no formal record mentions her leading troops or bearing arms. Chroniclers noted that the lady of the keep did not sleep, nor dine with comfort, but did keep the castle as if it were her own soul. Their wartime contributions were framed as anomalies, or as evidence of their loyalty to their husbands rather than their own agency or tactical brilliance. Honey poultices, vinegar rinses, and concoctions made from willow bark and yarrow were applied under their supervision. The addition of a small chapel wing might be a nod to prayers offered during bombardments. A rose garden might be planted in memory of fallen soldiers, tended by women whose grief found outlet in the only medium available to them, beauty. They ensured that the wounded were not only healed, but also protected from infection, a concept not fully understood in the medieval mind, but deeply observed through practical experience. These women were not simply caretakers or stand-ins for absent lords, they were commanders of last resort. Such moments blur the lines between traditional gender roles and lived necessity. Weapons in hand, when ladies became warriors, there are instances where noble women went beyond oversight and strategy. They took up arms. During the 13th century siege of Montségur, a stronghold of the Catholic heretics in southern France, it is said that women within the fortress fought alongside men to repel assaults from Catholic forces. And in Scotland, the tale of Black Agnes of Dunbar is both legendary and uniquely vivid. One of the most enduring images of Agnes is of her personally wiping dust from the battlements with her kerchief after the English used siege machines to hurl projectiles at the walls. Later, when a captured brother of hers was brought before the walls under threat of execution unless she surrendered, she is said to have retorted that his death would gain her another inheritance. Domestic spaces as defensive engines. The domestic duties expected of noble women, normally relegated to embroidery, child-rearing, and courtly entertainment, were transformed during sieges. The great halls became command centers. Kitchens became apothecaries. Women coordinated the treatment of wounded soldiers using what medicinal knowledge they had. It was in these environments that many noble women honed their most essential weapon, morale, the psychological toll, and the cult of stoicism. But with all their responsibilities and heroism came a heavy psychological burden. Writings in cloistered convents by later noble women reflect this trauma. Such emotional endurance was a kind of warfare too, albeit a silent one. Legacy and historical amnesia. When the siege lifted, whether through surrender, victory, or truce, noble women often faded into historical footnotes. Yet castles themselves sometimes held the memory. Inscriptions, room names, or additions made in the wake of a siege quietly honored the lady who held the line. Moreover, castle folklore passed down by scullery maids, grooms, and gatekeepers often retained stories of their mistresses' defiance far longer than court records. From garrison to ghosts, the mythologizing of lady defenders in the centuries that followed. These noble women became mythic in their own right. Such mythologizing speaks to the power and longevity of their stories even when chroniclers ignored them. The medieval castle was more than a fortress, it was a theater of survival, diplomacy, and female fortitude. They were not merely placeholders for absent men. They were tacticians, nurses, morale keepers. In warriors, we remember that knighthood was never solely defined by armor and jousts. In the long shadow of the medieval world, a quiet forgetting took place. Through centuries of retellings, revisions, and records inked by men with power, the stories of female knights, once vibrant, complex, and alive, faded into the soft margins of historical memory. They became footnotes, legends, anomalies. Their swords were lowered, not in surrender, but in silence imposed by time and politics. And yet, they were there, from the windswept steppes of the Mongol Empire, where daughters rode with the might of empires behind them, to the icy coastlines of Scandinavia, where shield maidens charged beside their brothers, to the isolated citadels of Occitania, where the order of the hatchet defended honor with blading. Hand women warriors existed. They thrived. They led. In medieval Europe, the chroniclers, clerics, and court historians were almost entirely male. These men came from institutions, namely the church and the monarchy, that had every incentive to uphold rigid gender roles. To step outside that role, particularly in a militarized and violent context, was to defy both divine and secular order. Thus, many chroniclers simply omitted such stories when they did record them. They were often framed as oddities, heretics, or exceptions to a male-dominated rule. But to understand why their legacy vanished from the mainstream record, we must look beyond their bravery and into the mechanisms that shape memory itself. The erasure begins: power, patriarchy. In paper, as the church consolidated power, it pushed increasingly narrow definitions of piety, obedience, and gender. A fighting woman was harder to sanctify. One of the most profound reasons female knights disappeared from history has to do with who controlled the narrative. The notion of a woman donning armor, taking command, or challenging a patriarchal order was not just socially inconvenient, it was often seen as spiritually dangerous and battlefield command. Faced ferocious opposition not just from the English, but from French clergy and officials. Her choice to wear male clothing and armor was deemed a sin, and used as justification for her execution. Women were meant to be vessels of virtue, keepers of the hearth, and models of chastity. In short, the archives of medieval history are not neutral. They vanished because the system stopped making room for them. Even widows who had ruled capably during times of siege were expected to step aside. Once a male heir came of age, they were curated, and curation is a form of control. With no fiefs to defend or troops to command, their natural entry points into martial culture were shut down. The complex truth of history could not compete with the simplicity of fiction. The role of the church sanctified gender roles throughout the High Middle Ages. The church's influence grew in both political and personal realms. But oral history, especially when not captured in writing, is vulnerable to extinction. He became the perfect Christian gentleman, brave, courteous, loyal to his lord, and devoted to his lady. And with each generation that passed without recording these memories, more was lost. But the details: her name, her deeds, her fate are gone. They've discovered wills, letters, and chronicles that paint a very different picture from the chivalric canon. While early Christianity offered some powerful female figures, martyrs, saints, and mystics, the militarization of women clashed with the evolving doctrines of modesty and subservience. While fiction cannot replace fact, it can inspire curiosity, and with curiosity comes research, rediscovery, and recognition. Notably, even figures like Joan of Arc, who was canonized for her divine visions. If even a saint could be burned for crossing gender boundaries, what chance did lesser-known women have? Law, inheritance, and the decline of female autonomy, but all of them, whether their names are preserved or long lost, left an imprint that no rewriting of history can fully erase. In earlier medieval periods, especially in tribal and frontier societies, women occasionally held significant power due to flexible kinship structures or inheritance laws that allowed daughters to inherit land, titles, and responsibilities. But as feudal systems matured and primogeniture, male-only inheritance became standard across Europe, women's access to military roles declined. Lands that once might have gone to a widow or daughter now passed to male cousins, brothers, or husbands. Female martial roles didn't vanish because women became less capable. Romanticizing the knight, a gendered ideal. Another force behind the erasure of female knights was the cultural redefinition of what it meant to be a knight. As chivalric literature exploded across Europe, Arthurian romances, troubadour epics, and courtly tales, the figure of the knight transformed from a feudal warrior into a romantic ideal. In this mythology, women were passive prizes, not participants. They were the ones rescued, not the rescuers. Even in cases where historical female knights existed, their stories were often reshaped to fit this narrative mold or erased completely. To avoid disrupting it, oral tradition and the fragility of memory, many stories of female warriors likely lived on in oral traditions, songs, folk tales, and family histories whispered around hearthfires. Plagues, wars, and shifting political landscapes wiped out countless local cultures and the stories they carried. In some rare cases, echoes remain. A stained glass window, a local legend, or a family crest might hint at a woman who once bore arms. The modern recovery, scholars, storytellers, and reclamation today, historians, archaeologists, and writers are working to unearth these buried histories. Feminist historians in particular have re-examined medieval sources with a fresh lens, questioning biased assumptions and digging deeper into records once dismissed. Authors of historical fiction have also played a role, bringing women warriors back into public imagination. Museums now feature exhibits on forgotten female warriors. Documentaries revisit the myths with modern eyes. University courses challenge long-held assumptions. The Silence is Ending, a quiet salute to the forgotten. This series has told the stories of women who stood against siege towers, galloped into battle, trained in secret, governed fortresses, and challenged the world's expectations. Some fought for their people, others for revenge, others simply because they could. And now, by listening, reading, and remembering, we bring them back not as myth, but as truth. They were not anomalies, they were possibilities, and in that, their legacy endures. As we approach the end of this long, quiet journey through time, I'd like to gently bring us full circle back to the quiet hush of torch-lit halls, and the echo of iron boots on ancient stone, back to the quiet strength of women in armor, of those who led defenses from castle towers, charged into battle on windswept plains, and who lived in the shadows of chronicles written without them. To all of you listening, perhaps lying back with your eyes closed, or resting after a long day, thank you for staying with me through the echoes of forgotten centuries. You've followed the footsteps of women long lost to the passing pages of history. It was purposeful, systematic, and most of all persistent. From noble warriors in Iberia to the quiet defiance of Japanese Onabugashia, to Mongol daughters riding besidekins, we've wandered far and wide, and yet now, in this final segment, we pause, not to recount another battle or another title, but to reflect on why their stories were hidden in the first place, and why uncovering them matters so deeply, because their erasure wasn't accidental. And yet, they endured. Why did the chroniclers not write of them? Why did the scribes of cathedrals, the monks of cloisters, and the royal historians pass over their names in silence? We've imagined what it meant to stand alone on the ramparts as a lady of the manor while the Lord was away, ordering archers into position as enemies approached. We've seen that a title like knight wasn't always bound to gender, it was bound to courage. By those who stepped beyond the line history tried to draw around them. It was simply easier for the record keepers of the past to frame strength and leadership through a single lens, that of men, because they had children to protect, lands to defend, vows to uphold, and strength to summon even if it meant defying every page of what they were supposed to be. It was easier to believe and to convince others that a woman's place was in the garden, not the garrison, and your dreams be filled with gentle echoes from a world long past, that her hands were made for needle and cradle, not shield and blade. The answer is as quiet and heavy as the walls of a medieval abbey. The world of the medieval woman knight is not a fantasy. It's simply a part of history that was hidden beneath layers of dust, waiting to be seen. Some stories were told but altered, softened, reframed. Thank you for letting me guide you through these forgotten tales. or their victories were folded into the legacies of brothers, husbands, and kings. A woman who defended her city became a matronly figure who merely encouraged the garrison. A female warrior who led charges became exceptional, an anomaly, the only one of her kind. And those who didn't fit the mold, those women vanished. Yet by exploring their stories, even in the quiet hours like these, we've gained something. We've reclaimed voices. We've unearthed the lives of real women who defied norms, not for fame or legend, but because necessity called them. These women remind us that history is not only shaped by great battles and crowned kings, but by those who dared to act when no one expected them to. And now, as this video ends, softly, gently, I hope you'll carry these stories with you, not with urgency, but with quiet respect, not with anger, but with understanding. So to you, dear listener, whether you're drifting off to sleep or simply enjoying this peaceful moment in the dark, thank you. And as always, wherever you are, whether in the hush of night or the calm of early dawn, may your rest be deep. Until next time, this has been the Sleepless Historian. Good night.